The howling wind carried ice crystals that cut like shattered glass across the Wyoming territory. December 1889 had brought the worst blizzard in living memory, transforming the rolling plains into a frozen wasteland of white death. Through this hellscape, Margaret Sullivan pushed her mare forward, squinting against the blinding snow, Winchester rifle clutched in her gloved hands. The tracks were disappearing rapidly beneath fresh powder, but she'd been born tracking game with her father in Tennessee hills. Even in this whiteout, she could follow the path of the cattle rustlers who'd tried to take what little remained of her herd. Her breath formed crystalline clouds as she muttered prayers and curses in equal measure. At 32, Margaret Sullivan was no stranger to hardship. Her face, once considered pretty, in a classical sense, had been weathered by sun and worry into something harder and more resolute. Her dark hair, streaked prematurely with silver at the temples, was tucked beneath a man's slouch hat, her slim frame buried beneath layers of wool, and her late husband's sheepskin coat. A flash of movement ahead made her rein in sharply. Through the curtain of white, she could make out the silhouette of a man on horseback, driving 3 of her longhorns ahead of him. "Stop right there!" she called, raising the Winchester to her shoulder. The figure turned, and for an instant their eyes met across the snowy void. He was bearded, his face partially obscured by a snow-crusted scarf, but she could see his eyes widen in surprise. Instead of raising his hands, he reached for something at his waist. Margaret didn't hesitate. The Winchester roared, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the howling wind. The man jerked backward, clutching his side, and toppled from his horse into the snow. The cattle, startled by the gunshot, scattered into the white void. "Damn it all!" Margaret muttered, dismounting carefully. She approached the fallen man with her rifle still trained on him, ready for any sudden moves. But as she drew closer, she realized he wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was fumbling with a piece of paper clutched in his gloved hand. "Lady, you've made a mistake," he gasped, blood seeping between his fingers where he clutched his side. "I don't make mistakes about men stealing my cattle," Margaret said coldly. "Not stealing," he managed, holding out the blood-stained paper. "Protecting. Tracked rustlers, real ones. 3 men." Margaret hesitated, then snatched the paper from him. It was a hastily drawn map of her property, with markings showing cattle movements and tracks. Across the top was scrawled, "Sullivan Homestead, Priority Protection Orders of Sheriff Collins." She looked down at the wounded man with new eyes. "Who are you?" "Jake Reland." He coughed, blood speckling his beard. "Former Pinkerton. Working for myself now." "Why would Sheriff Collins hire you to protect my cattle?" Margaret demanded, suspicion thick in her voice. "Not just yours, all small ranchers." Jake's eyes were growing unfocused. "Association's getting bold, making moves before spring invasion." The wind howled louder, driving the temperature down further. Margaret made a quick calculation. The man would die out here within the hour, and if what he said was true— "Can you ride?" she asked abruptly. Jake Ryland tried to sit up, then fell back with a grunt of pain. "Not likely." Margaret sighed her breath, a white cloud dissolving into the storm. "I'll get you on my horse. My place is closer than town." She shook her head. "If you're lying to me, Mr. Ryland, I'll finish what that bullet started." "Fair enough," he managed, as consciousness began to slip away from him. The one-story ranch house hunched against the storm smoke from its chimney, torn sideways by the relentless wind. Margaret half-dragged, half-carried the semi-conscious man up the front steps, leaving a trail of blood droplets on the fresh snow. She kicked at the door with her boot. "Samuel, open up, son." The door swung open to reveal a solemn-faced boy of about 10. His eyes, gray like his mother's, widened at the sight of the wounded stranger. "Mama, who is? Help me get him to the bed in the spare room." Margaret cut him off, no time for explanations. "Then fetch the medical kit and heat water." Samuel nodded once, moving with precise mechanical efficiency. He didn't ask questions or panic, not his way. The boy had his own rhythm, his own manner of processing the world. Thomas had never understood their son's differences, but Margaret had learned to appreciate Samuel's unique mind. Together, they maneuvered Jake onto the narrow bed in what had once been Thomas's study. Margaret cut away his blood-soaked shirt, revealing a nasty wound in his left side where her bullet had torn through flesh. "Clean through, at least," she muttered, more to herself than to Samuel, who watched with clinical detachment. "No bullet to dig out." "His core temperature is too low," Samuel observed in his precise way. "Hypothermia. Yes, we need to warm him slowly." Margaret began efficient first aid cleaning and bandaging the wound. "Samuel, bring the extra blankets and put more wood on the fire." As the boy left, Jake's eyes fluttered open. "Your son?" "Yes," Margaret replied curtly, pressing a bandage against his wound. "Seems smart." "He is. Now be quiet and save your strength." Jake studied her face for a moment before speaking again. "You shot me. You were with my cattle in a blizzard." A ghost of a smile touched his pale lips. "Fair point." "Why were you really on my land, Mr. Ryland?" Margaret asked, tying off the bandage with practiced hands. "Told you, associations targeting small ranchers, making it look like rustling." His voice was steadier now, though pain lined his face. "Your name's at the top of their list." "Why would I be their priority?" "Your husband," Jake said, watching her carefully. "Captain Thomas Sullivan, Union Army. Hero at Gettysburg. Man like that, homesteading successfully, gives others ideas, sets an example." Margaret's hands stilled. "Thomas has been dead for 8 months. Yet you're still here, still fighting." Jake's eyes held a respect that Margaret wasn't accustomed to seeing from men. "That makes you dangerous in their eyes." Before she could respond, Samuel returned with an armful of blankets. His gaze moved between the two adults, absorbing their conversation without comment. "He needs broth, Mama," Samuel said flatly. "And laudanum for the pain." "I don't need," Jake began. "You'll take what you're given." Margaret cut him off, rising to her feet. "Samuel, stay with him. If he tries to get up, you have my permission to hit him with the fire poker." The boy nodded solemnly, taking a seat in the corner chair, his unblinking gaze fixed on the stranger in the bed. As Margaret left the room, she heard Jake murmur to her son, "You mind telling me if your mother makes a habit of shooting visitors?" "Only the suspicious ones," came Samuel's matter-of-fact reply. Night had fallen, the blizzard intensifying until the windows rattled in their frames. Margaret sat at her kitchen table examining the papers she'd found in Jake Ryland's saddlebags. Maps of the county, notes on cattle movements, and most disturbing, a list of names. Homesteaders and small ranchers with her name at the top, marked with a red X. She looked up as Samuel entered, his movements precise and careful as always. "He's sleeping now," the boy reported. "His temperature is stabilizing and the bleeding has slowed." Margaret nodded. "Thank you for helping Samuel." The boy hesitated, a rare moment of uncertainty. "Is he a bad man, Mama?" Margaret considered the question carefully. Samuel's world was ordered and logical. He preferred clear categories. "I don't know yet. He says he's trying to help us, but trust requires verification." Samuel finished one of his father's military phrases that he'd adopted. Exactly. She smiled faintly. How are you feeling about all this? Samuel tilted his head slightly, processing. Curious, cautious, a pause. Not afraid. Margaret reached out and squeezed his hand. Her brilliant, different boy, who saw the world through such a unique lens. That's good. Now, get some sleep. I'll keep watch tonight. After Samuel had gone to his room, Margaret stoked the fire and settled into the rocking chair with Thomas's old service revolver across her lap. The wind moaned around the eaves like a chorus of lost souls, and she found herself thinking about the man sleeping in their spare room. Jake Ryland, former Pinkerton detective, a man who claimed to be protecting her family from threats she hadn't even fully grasped. She'd always known that the Wyoming Stock Growers Association resented small ranchers like herself. The big cattle barons viewed the homesteaders as intruders, thieves of land and water rights. But this systematic targeting, this list, it suggested something more organized and sinister than the usual intimidation. Her thoughts drifted to Thomas. Captain Thomas Sullivan, once so strong and commanding, reduced by the war to a shell haunted by nightmares and melancholy. He'd sought the Wyoming Territory as a place to heal, to build something new away from the blood-soaked fields of the East. For a time it had worked. They'd built the ranch together, had Samuel created a life. But the darkness never truly left him. The doctors called it soldier's heart. That deep weariness, the startled reactions to loud noises, the nights he'd wake up screaming about Gettysburg. 8 months ago, she'd found him behind the barn, with his service revolver in his hand and a bullet in his head. At least, that's what everyone believed had happened. A floorboard creaked, and Margaret snapped to attention, raising the revolver. Jake Ryland stood in the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame. His torso was bandaged, his face pale but alert. "You should be in bed," Margaret said, not lowering the gun. "Probably," he agreed. "But we need to talk, Mrs. Sullivan, and I don't know how much time we have." "Talk about what? About the fact that your husband didn't kill himself." Jake's eyes held hers steadily. "He was murdered." The revolver in Margaret's hand didn't waver, but something inside her did. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Ryland. It's why I'm here. It's why I've been tracking the association's men." Jake took a careful step forward, wincing. "May I sit? This wound you gave me is making it hard to be intimidating while standing." Margaret gestured to the chair across from her with the barrel of the revolver. "Talk, and make it convincing." Jake lowered himself gingerly into the chair. "I was hired 6 months ago by Sheriff James Collins to look into a series of accidents and suicides among homesteaders. Too many to be coincidence. Collins suspected foul play, but needed someone outside official channels. Why? Because half the county officials are in the association's pocket. The other half are too scared to act." Jake leaned forward, intensity in his gaze. "I've been building a case, tracking their operations. They're planning something big for spring. A coordinated effort to drive out every small rancher in Johnson County." "And Thomas, what evidence do you have that he was murdered?" Jake held her gaze. "The angle of the wound. Your husband was right-handed, but the entry wound suggested a left-handed shooter. The missing shell casing. And most damning, Thomas had gathered evidence against Major Wolcott, one of the association's leaders." Margaret's hand tightened on the revolver. Major Frederick Wolcott, a name she knew well. He'd been Thomas's commanding officer during the war, had even visited their ranch occasionally. After Thomas's death, he'd been the first to offer to buy her out. "What kind of evidence? That's what I don't know yet. But whatever Thomas discovered, it was worth killing him for." Jake grimaced, adjusting his position. Mrs. Sullivan, I don't expect you to trust me, but this storm won't last forever. When it breaks, you need to be prepared. The association believes you have whatever evidence Thomas gathered. They won't stop coming for you and your son. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, the wind's howl had begun to diminish, suggesting the storm was finally weakening. Get some rest, Mr. Ryland, Margaret said, finally rising from her chair. We'll continue this conversation in the morning. And if I'm gone in the morning? Jake asked. Margaret allowed herself a small, cold smile. In your condition with this weather, you wouldn't make it a mile. She checked the revolver's cylinder, a deliberate gesture. Besides, I've moved your boots and gun. Consider yourself my guest, indefinitely. As she turned to leave, Jake called after her softly. He talked about you, you know, Thomas, during the war. Even then, he said you were the strongest person he'd ever known. Said you could outshoot, outride, and outthink most men. Margaret paused at the doorway but didn't turn around. Good night, Mr. Ryland. Later in her bedroom, Margaret opened the small drawer of her bedside table and removed a folded piece of paper. Thomas's last note found in his pocket after his death. Most had assumed it was a suicide note, but it contained only a string of numbers and the initials F.W., Frederick Wolcott. She'd never understood its meaning, had assumed it was related to Thomas's confused mental state in his final days. Now she wondered if it might be something else entirely. A code, a location, evidence. The wind died down to a whisper, and in the sudden quiet, Margaret could hear the creaking of the house settling the distant howl of a wolf pack, and beneath it all, the soft, steady breathing of her son in the next room. Samuel, who'd already lost his father. Samuel, who might be in danger because of something Thomas had discovered. Margaret Sullivan slipped the paper back into the drawer and checked her revolver one more time. Whether Jake Ryland was telling the truth or spinning lies, one thing was certain. She would protect her son and her land with every breath in her body. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, Major Wolcott, and anyone else who threatened what was hers would learn that lesson the hard way. Outside, the storm finally broke, stars appearing in the clearing sky. The temperature plummeted further in the sudden stillness, freezing the new-fallen snow into a hard crust that would bear the weight of men and horses come morning. They were coming. Margaret knew it with bone-deep certainty, and this time she would be ready. Sheriff James Collins stomped his boots on the porch of the Sullivan Ranch, knocking snow from them before rapping on the doorframe. The storm had broken overnight, leaving behind a crystalline landscape and bitter cold that made his old war wound ache. At 45, James felt the weather in every bone that had been broken in the conflict that still divided the nation's memory. The door opened, revealing Margaret Sullivan with a shotgun held casually at her side. Her gray eyes narrowed at the sight of him. Sheriff Collins, what brings you out this way after a storm? Morning, Margaret. He removed his hat, revealing salt and pepper hair cropped short. Checking on outlying homesteads. Storm like that one can be deadly. We survived, she said, not inviting him in. James shifted uncomfortably. He and Margaret had a complicated relationship. He'd been Thomas's friend during and after the war, had even stood as Samuel's godfather at his christening. But since Thomas's death, Margaret had grown distant, suspicious of his attempts to help. Look, Margaret, I need to ask if you've seen... Sheriff Jake Ryland appeared behind Margaret, moving stiffly but upright. Didn't expect to see you so soon. James's eyebrows shot up. What the hell happened to you, Ryland? Mrs. Sullivan and I had a misunderstanding involving her Winchester. Jake's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. She thought I was rustling. I was tracking rustlers. Margaret stepped aside reluctantly. You might as well come in, Sheriff. Seems you two have matters to discuss. The interior of the Sullivan home was warm and ordered. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of coffee and biscuits filled the air. Samuel sat at the table methodically arranging his breakfast in a precise pattern before eating. He looked up at the sheriff's entrance, nodded once in acknowledgement, then returned to his task. "Morning, Samuel," James said gently. The boy had always fascinated and saddened him. So brilliant, yet so different from other children. Thomas had never fully accepted his son's peculiarities, had pushed too hard for normalcy. Margaret, though, had a way with the boy, an understanding that went beyond words. "Your core temperature is elevated," Samuel observed without looking up. "You've been riding hard despite the cold. Urgent business." James exchanged a glance with Jake, who shrugged as if to say, "Told you the kid was smart." "Yes, urgent business indeed," James confirmed, accepting the cup of coffee Margaret offered. 3 men were found frozen to death about 5 miles east of here. Cattle rustlers by the looks of them. "The men I was tracking," Jake said, easing himself into a chair with a wince. "They'd hit 2 other homesteads before targeting Mrs. Sullivan's." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You knew they were coming here specifically." "Had a strong suspicion. Your place is isolated, your herd small enough to move quickly." Jake glanced at the sheriff. "They weren't ordinary rustlers." "No," James agreed grimly. 2 of them worked for the Bar Cross Ranch, association men. A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, the powerful coalition of wealthy ranchers who viewed themselves as the territory's true authority. They controlled the best grazing lands, the water rights, and increasingly the local government. "So the association is rustling from homesteaders now?" Margaret asked, her voice hard. "Isn't that something you should be investigating?" "Sheriff," James sighed. "It's not that simple, Margaret. There's no brand on the cattle they were driving. No proof they weren't legitimately moving their own stock. They were on my land, in a blizzard. They could claim they got disoriented." "Dead men don't make claims," Margaret said coldly. James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The Margaret Sullivan he'd known years ago, Thomas's spirited, warm-hearted bride, had been replaced by this hardened, suspicious woman. He couldn't blame her, not after everything that had happened. "Margaret," he said gently, "I'm trying to help, but you need to understand what we're up against. The association has money, influence, and men with guns. Lots of men with guns." "And the law," she challenged. "Whose side are you on, James?" The sheriff met her gaze steadily. "I'm on the side of preventing a bloodbath. That's why I hired Ryland here, to gather evidence, build a case that might stand up in territorial court." "And if it doesn't," Margaret pressed. "Then God help us all come spring," James said quietly. Samuel, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke. "They'll come for us first." His voice was flat, factual. "Because of what Papa knew." The adults turned to look at the boy, whose gray eyes held a clarity that belied his years. "What do you mean, son?" James asked carefully. "Papa had a book. He wrote in it every night." Samuel continued arranging his food in precise patterns. He said it contained the truth that would burn them all down. His exact words. "I remember everything exactly." Margaret stared at her son. Thomas had a journal. Samuel nodded once. "He hid it before he died. Said if anything happened to him, the book would be his revenge." "Samuel." Jake leaned forward intently. "Do you know where he hid this book?" The boy shook his head. "No, but he said it was where fire meets water under the watchful eye. That's a riddle. Papa liked riddles. James and Jake exchanged looks. Thomas Sullivan, even before the war, melancholy took him, had been known for his cryptic way of thinking, his love of puzzles and codes. "We need to find that journal," James said quietly. "Before they do." "And who is they?" "Exactly," Margaret demanded. "Major Frederick Wolcott, for one," Jake said, watching her reaction closely. "Frank Canton, Tom Horn." Margaret's face paled slightly at the last name. Even in Wyoming, Tom Horn's reputation as a killer for hire was legendary. He'd made his name hunting Apaches for the Army, then renegade Indians for the Pinkerton Agency. Now he sold his tracking and killing skills to the highest bidder, often the Association. "Why would they send someone like Horn after small ranchers?" she asked. "Because they're planning something big," James said grimly. "Something they can't afford to have exposed. The Association is bringing in men from Texas, gunmen, hired killers. They're creating a private army." "For what purpose?" "To cleanse Johnson County," Jake said bluntly. "To eliminate every homesteader, every small operation that doesn't align with their interests. They're calling it solving the rustler problem, but it's nothing short of a planned massacre." Samuel had stopped eating, his eyes moving between the adults with keen attention. "Like Gettysburg," he said suddenly. "Papa said Gettysburg smelled like metal and meat. He cried when he said it." Margaret placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder. "Samuel, why don't you go check on the horses? Make sure they have fresh water." The boy looked at her for a long moment, understanding, passing between them, then nodded and left without argument. When he was gone, Margaret turned back to the men, her expression hardened. "If what you're saying is true, why not bring in federal marshals?" "The Army. Wyoming's pushing for statehood," James explained. "The territorial governor is walking a political tightrope. The Association has powerful friends in Washington, senators' business interests. No one wants to risk delaying statehood over what they're calling local disputes." "Local disputes," Margaret repeated bitterly. "Is that what Thomas's death was?" An uncomfortable silence fell. Finally, Jake spoke. "Mrs. Sullivan, I believe your husband was killed because he discovered details of the Association's plan. The journal Samuel mentioned could be the evidence we need to stop them before the bloodshed starts." "And if I help you find it," Margaret challenged, "what then? You take it to your corrupt officials, it disappears, and we're still left unprotected." "No," James said firmly. "We take it to Governor Warren directly. He's a decent man caught between powerful interests. With solid evidence, he'd have no choice but to act." Margaret looked between the two men, weighing their words against her instinct for self-preservation. "And in the meantime, the Association already thinks I have whatever evidence Thomas gathered. They won't wait patiently while we search for riddles." "That's why I'm staying," Jake said simply. "To protect you and Samuel while we figure this out." "With a bullet hole in your side," Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Forgive me if that doesn't inspire confidence." "I've worked with worse." Jake shrugged, then winced at the movement. "Besides, I heal quick." James stood settling his hat back on his head. "I need to get back to town before my absence raises questions. The Association has eyes everywhere." He looked at Margaret intently. "Think about what we've said. And Margaret, be careful. These men won't hesitate to hurt you or Samuel if they think you're standing in their way." After the sheriff had gone, Margaret and Jake sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, she spoke. "You really believe Thomas was murdered?" It wasn't a question, but Jake answered anyway. "Yes, I've been investigating it for months. The evidence doesn't support suicide." "What evidence specifically?" Jake met her gaze. The angle of the wound, the missing shell casing, the fact that Thomas had arranged to meet with Governor Warren the very next day. He paused. And there's something else. Major Wolcott visited him the day before he died. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. Wolcott was here. According to my sources, yes. No one knows what they discussed. Margaret rose abruptly and went to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. In the barnyard, she could see Samuel methodically checking the water troughs, his movements precise and orderly. If what you're saying is true, she said without turning, then I've spent 8 months believing a lie. That the man I loved chose to leave us. I'm sorry, Jake said quietly. I know that's not easy to hear. Margaret turned back to him, her gray eyes hard as flint. Mr. Ryland, if you're going to stay here, there are things you should understand. I don't trust easily. I don't accept help without question. And I don't take risks with my son's safety. Fair enough. And that said, she continued, I want the truth about Thomas, and I want the people responsible to pay. Her voice hardened. So we'll find this journal, and then we'll see about justice. Jake nodded slowly. Where do we start? Where fire meets water, under the watchful eye. Margaret repeated Samuel's words. Thomas loved his riddles, but they usually had meaning specific to us, to this place. She thought for a moment. There's a spot where Clear Creek runs past a ridge of red rock. The Indians called it the Eye of the Earth because of a cave opening shaped like an eye. Thomas used to fish there. Fire could refer to the red rock, Jake suggested. It's a start, at least. We'll go tomorrow, Margaret decided. I need to check the herd today, make sure none strayed during the storm. Jake stood carefully. I'll help. Margaret gave him a skeptical look. With a bullet wound. Like I said, I've worked with worse. His eyes held hers. Mrs. Sullivan, whether you trust me or not, we're in this together now. The association is coming, not just for your land, but for your life. And Samuel's. I intend to stop them. Margaret studied him for a long moment, seeing the determination in his weathered face, the resolve in his stance despite his injury. Finally, she nodded once. Then, you'd better start calling me Margaret, she said, and you'll need a heavier coat. Wyoming winters kill the unprepared. As she turned to fetch her own coat, Margaret felt a strange mixture of dread and something like hope stirring within her. For 8 months, she'd been fighting alone, against the elements, against poverty, against the whispers that she should sell the ranch and take Samuel back east. Now, suddenly, there was someone fighting alongside her. Whether that would prove salvation or damnation remained to be seen. Outside, the winter sun glinted off the snow with diamond brightness. In the distance, the mountains stood like ancient sentinels against the azure sky. This land, beautiful, harsh, unforgiving, had called to Thomas as a place of healing after the war's horrors. Instead, it had become his grave. Margaret adjusted her hat and checked her rifle with practiced hands. If what Jake and Sheriff Collins believed was true, powerful men wanted her and Samuel dead. Men who thought their money and influence put them above the law. Well, they were about to learn differently. Because if Thomas had been murdered, if he'd died trying to expose their plans, then Margaret would finish what he started. For justice, for Samuel's future, for the memory of the man who'd once been her whole world, and God help anyone who stood in her way. The morning dawned brittle and clear, the temperature well below zero, as Margaret and Jake rode toward the eastern boundary of her property. Their breath formed white clouds, that hung in the still air before dissipating. The horses moved carefully across the snow-crusted landscape, hooves breaking through the frozen surface with each step. Despite his wound, Jake sat tall in the saddle. Margaret had to admit he was tougher than she'd initially given him credit for. The beard couldn't hide the lines of pain around his mouth, but he made no complaint as they traversed the difficult terrain. "How much further to this eye of the earth?" he asked, adjusting his borrowed coat. "About a mile past that ridge," Margaret pointed. "Thomas used to say it was his thinking place, said the sound of the water helped clear his mind." Jake nodded, studying the countryside with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading landscapes for threats. "Good defensive position, natural shelter, water source. Your husband chose well. He was a military man. Strategy came naturally to him." A shadow crossed Margaret's face. "At least before the war changed him." "Soldier's heart," Jake said quietly. "I've seen it. Good men who can't escape the battlefield even years later." Margaret glanced at him. "You fought?" "No, too young for the big one. But I've tracked enough deserters and veterans gone wrong to recognize the signs." He met her gaze. "For what it's worth, I think Thomas was a stronger man than most, lasting as long as he did with those demons." The unexpected compassion in his voice caught her off guard. Margaret had grown used to people in town whispering about Thomas's weakness, his cowardice, in taking his own life. To hear someone speak of his struggles with understanding rather than judgment was unsettling. "There," she said, changing the subject as they crested a small rise. "You can see the red rocks ahead." The formation rose dramatically from the snow-covered plains, a wall of rust-colored stone cut through by the ribbon of Clear Creek, which remained unfrozen at its center due to the speed of its current. Midway up the rock face was a cave opening roughly oval in shape that did indeed resemble a watchful eye. They dismounted at the base of the formation, tethering the horses to a stunted pine. "Creek's running high for winter," Jake observed, eyeing the churning water with caution. "Snowmelt from the higher elevations," Margaret explained, retrieving a rope from her saddlebag. "There's a narrow path that leads up to the cave, but it'll be treacherous with ice." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You've climbed it before." "Many times. Thomas and I used to come here when we first homesteaded." A brief, sad smile touched her lips. "Before Samuel, before the nightmares got bad. We'd sit in that cave and plan our future." Something unreadable flickered in Jake's eyes. "I'll go first. Test the path. With your wound, I don't think—" "I'm lighter than you," he interrupted, then had the grace to look embarrassed. "What I mean is, I've done this kind of climbing before. If the path gives way better, it happens to me than to Samuel's only remaining parent." The logic was sound, if blunt. Margaret handed him the rope. "Tie off at that juniper halfway up. I'll follow once you've secured it." Jake nodded and began the ascent. Despite his injury, he moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to difficult terrain. Margaret watched his progress, critically noting how he tested each handhold before committing his weight, how he used his legs to compensate for the weakness in his torso. This was a man who had survived his share of dangerous situations. The question remained, could she trust him with her life? With Samuel's. 20 minutes later, they stood inside the cave, a shallow depression in the rock face that offered shelter from the wind and a commanding view of the surrounding plains. The floor was sandy and dry, the walls smooth from centuries of wind erosion. "What exactly are we looking for?" Jake asked, scanning the cave interior. "I'm not sure," Margaret admitted, running her hands along the rock walls. "Where fire meets water under the watchful eye. We're in the eye with the red rocks, fire, and the creek, water, below us. But I don't see anything that could be a hiding place." Jake moved deeper into the cave, examining the ground carefully. "Wait," he said suddenly, kneeling despite the obvious pain it caused him. "The sand here is different, looser." Margaret joined him, seeing what he'd noticed, a section of the cave floor where the sand seemed less compacted than the surrounding areas. Together, they began clearing it away, revealing a flat stone beneath. "It's been moved recently," Jake observed, pointing to scratch marks along the edges. "Within the last year, I'd say." With combined effort, they lifted the stone to reveal a small hollow beneath. Inside lay an oilskin-wrapped package, roughly the size of a ledger book. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she lifted it out. "This has to be it. We should get back to the ranch," Jake said, glancing toward the cave entrance. "I don't like being exposed like this." Margaret nodded, tucking the package securely inside her coat. The descent proved more difficult than the climb, the afternoon sun having melted the surface snow enough to make the path slick and unpredictable. Jake went first again, moving slowly to test each step before Margaret followed. They were halfway down when the crack of a rifle shot echoed across the landscape. A chunk of rock exploded near Margaret's head, sending fragments flying. "Sniper!" Jake shouted, reaching up to pull her down faster. "Move!" Another shot rang out, this one kicking up snow at the base of the path. Margaret caught a glimpse of movement on a rise about a quarter-mile away. A lone horseman with what appeared to be a long rifle. "The horses!" she gasped as they reached the bottom half, sliding the last few feet. "No time!" Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a cluster of boulders that had fallen from the cliff face centuries earlier. "He's got the high ground and a clear shot at the trail to the horses." They ducked behind the largest boulder as another bullet ricocheted off the rock with a whine. Jake drew his revolver, checking the cylinder with practiced hands. "One man, from what I can see," he said, peering carefully around the edge of their shelter. "But that doesn't mean he's alone." Margaret pulled her Winchester from its scabbard, which she'd kept with her rather than leaving it with the horses. Who would be watching this place? Someone who knew what Thomas hid. Jake's expression was grim. "Or someone who's been following us." "Can you tell who it is?" Jake shook his head. "Too far for details, but that's a Sharp's rifle judging by the sound. Long-range buffalo gun, professional equipment." Margaret's blood ran cold. "Tom Horn uses a Sharps." "So do a lot of men," Jake cautioned, though his expression suggested he'd had the same thought. "Whoever it is, they're pinning us down for a reason, either waiting for reinforcements or trying to keep us here until dark." "We can't stay," Margaret said. "Samuel's alone at the ranch." Jake nodded, his eyes scanning their surroundings with tactical precision. "The creek. It's our only option. If we can make it to the water, we can use the bank for cover and double back to the horses from downstream." Margaret glanced at the rushing water dubiously. "It's freezing. We'd have minutes at most before hypothermia sets in." "Better than taking a Sharp's bullet," Jake countered. "We'll have to move fast. On my signal, run straight for the deepest part of the creek. Don't stop, don't look back." Another shot rang out, this one striking the ground just behind their boulder. The shooter was adjusting his position, trying to get a better angle. "Now!" Jake shouted, breaking cover and firing his revolver twice in the direction of the sniper, not with any hope of hitting him at that distance, but to force him to duck and buy them precious seconds. Margaret ran the package clutched tightly against her chest, zigzagging, as Thomas had taught her years ago. The creek loomed ahead, its dark waters uninviting, but offering their only chance of escape. She heard Jake's heavy footsteps behind her, heard the distant crack of the Sharps again, felt something tug at her coat sleeve. Then she was plunging into the icy creek, the cold, a physical shock that stole her breath. The current grabbed her immediately, stronger than she'd anticipated. She fought to keep her head above water to keep the precious package from getting soaked. Jake splashed in beside her, grimacing as the cold water hit his wound. "Downstream," he gasped, pointing toward a bend in the creek, where the bank rose higher, offering better cover. They let the current carry them, using their free arms to steer toward the far bank. The cold was already seeping into Margaret's bones, making her fingers clumsy and her thoughts sluggish. She could see Jake struggling beside her, his face pale with pain and cold. After what seemed an eternity, but couldn't have been more than a minute, they reached the bend. Jake dragged himself onto the bank first, then reached back to help Margaret. They collapsed on the muddy shore, gasping and shivering violently. "We need to move," Jake said through chattering teeth. "Get warm. Hypothermia's already setting in." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past her own shivering. The package inside her coat was damp but intact, protected by the oilskin wrapping. She struggled to her feet, her sodden clothes weighing her down like lead. "There's a line shack," she managed, pointing downstream. "Half a mile. Emergency shelter." Jake pulled himself up, wincing as the movement reopened his wound. Fresh blood stained his shirt, mixing with the creek water. "Lead the way." They staggered through the snow, leaving a clear trail that any tracker could follow. But they had no choice. Without shelter and fire, they would freeze to death within the hour. The line shack appeared just as Margaret's legs were beginning to fail her. A small, crude structure built to shelter cowboys during roundups or blizzards. Inside was a single room with a small iron stove, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow cot. Jake barred the door behind them, while Margaret fumbled with frozen fingers to light the stove, using the kindling and matches stored beside it. Within minutes, a small fire was blazing, casting flickering light throughout the sparse interior. "We need to get out of these wet clothes," Jake said, practical despite the intimate implication. "No point in surviving bullets only to die of cold." Margaret nodded her mind, too focused on survival to worry about propriety. They turned their backs to each other, stripping off sodden layers and wrapping themselves in the rough wool blankets stored on the cot. Their clothes were hung near the stove to dry, steam rising as the heat penetrated the frozen fabric. "Let me see your wound," Margaret said once they were settled, both huddled as close to the stove as safety allowed. Jake reluctantly opened his blanket enough to reveal his side. The bullet wound was angry and red, bleeding sluggishly. Margaret cleaned it as best she could with supplies from the small medical kit kept in the shack, then rebandaged it with strips torn from one of the extra blankets. "Who taught you field medicine?" Jake asked, watching her efficient movements. "Thomas, and necessity." She tied off the bandage with a precise knot. "When you're 2 days' ride from the nearest doctor, you learn to handle emergencies yourself." Jake nodded, studying her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see more than she was comfortable revealing. "You're a remarkable woman, Margaret Sullivan." "I'm a survivor, Mr. Ryland. Nothing more." She turned away, uncomfortable with the admiration in his eyes. "We should examine what Thomas hid." The package, once unwrapped, revealed a leather-bound journal and a folded set of papers. Margaret opened the journal with reverent hands, recognizing Thomas's precise handwriting immediately. The entries began shortly after they'd moved to Wyoming and continued until the day before his death. "He was investigating the association," Margaret said quietly, scanning the pages. "Recording their meetings, their plans, their illegal activities." Jake leaned closer, careful to maintain the modesty of his blanket. "Does he mention Wolcott specifically?" Margaret flipped through the journal until she found entries from the final month. "Yes, here." She began to read aloud. "April 15th, 1889. Met with W today. He offered to buy the ranch again, price higher this time. When I refused, the threats began. Veiled but clear. He knows I've been gathering evidence. Mentioned Samuel asked if I'd considered his future without a father. I've never struck a superior officer, not even during the worst of the war. But today I came close. She turned the page and her voice growing tighter as she continued. April 20th, 1889. Confirmed what I suspected. The association is planning something unprecedented. W has been authorized to solve the rustler problem permanently. They're bringing in men from Texas professional killers, not just to intimidate, but to eliminate. They have a list, names of everyone they plan to remove. My name is on it. So are 30 others. The blacklist, Jake said grimly. I've heard rumors, but never seen proof. Margaret turned to the folded papers that had accompanied the journal. They contained names, dates, locations, a detailed account of the association's activities and future plans. And there on the final page was a list of names with her own and Thomas's at the top. He was right, she whispered. They're planning a massacre. This is what got him killed, Jake said quietly. This is evidence that could bring down the most powerful men in the territory. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes hard. Then we use it. We take it to the governor, just as Sheriff Collins suggested. It's not that simple, Jake cautioned. The association has men everywhere. Getting to Cheyenne without being intercepted will be nearly impossible, especially now that they know we've found the journal. Then what do you suggest? Margaret demanded. Wait here until they send more men to kill us, to kill Samuel. The mention of her son seemed to strike Jake like a physical blow. Samuel, he said, we've been gone for hours. If they knew to watch the cave, Margaret's blood turned to ice. They might know about the ranch, about Samuel. Their eyes met in shared horror, all thoughts of personal discomfort forgotten. We need to get back, Jake said, standing despite his injury and reaching for his still damp clothes. Now, they pushed the horses hard, taking a circuitous route back to the ranch in case the sniper was still watching the direct path. The winter sun was already setting by the time they crested the final rise that overlooked the Sullivan property. Margaret reined in sharply, a strangled sound escaping her throat. Below, a column of smoke rose from where her barn had stood that morning. Even from a distance, they could see the charred skeleton of the structure still smoldering against the snow. Samuel, she whispered, fear making her voice crack. She spurred her horse forward recklessly, plunging down the slope with Jake close behind. The main house appeared intact as they thundered into the yard. But the barn was a total loss. Worse, there was no sign of Samuel or Ingrid Peterson, the Swedish neighbor who sometimes watched him when Margaret had to be away. Samuel, Margaret called, leaping from her horse before it had fully stopped. Samuel, where are you? The front door of the house burst open, and Samuel appeared, his face smudged with soot, but otherwise unharmed. Behind him stood Ingrid Peterson, a shotgun clutched in her weathered hands. Mama! Samuel ran to Margaret, who dropped to her knees in the snow and gathered him into a fierce embrace. What happened? Jake asked Ingrid, dismounting more carefully, one hand pressed to his side. Men came, the Swedish woman said, her accent thickening with anger. 4 of them. They say they look for stolen cattle. When I tell them to leave, they burn barn. Try to come in-house, but I have gun. She patted the shotgun with grim satisfaction. They go away when I shoot. Say they come back. Margaret released Samuel enough to look into his face. Are you hurt? Did they hurt you? I'm uninjured, Samuel said in his precise way. Mrs. Peterson hid me in the root cellar when they came. I counted 642 seconds before the fire started. Did you recognize any of them? Jake asked. Samuel considered this with his characteristic thoroughness. One man had a star on his coat, like Sheriff Collins, but not Sheriff Collins. He called another man Canton. They were looking for a book. Jake and Margaret exchanged glances. Frank Canton, the association's enforcer, a former lawman turned hired gun. They're getting bolder, Jake said quietly, using deputy badges to give their actions a veneer of legality. Margaret stood, keeping Samuel close to her side. Mrs. Peterson, thank you for protecting my son. You should get home before dark. They might come back. The older woman nodded, though her eyes showed concern. You should come with me. My farm has many sons to protect it. We'll be fine, Margaret assured her, though the lie felt hollow even as she said it. We'll be leaving soon ourselves. After Ingrid had gone, they entered the house, which showed signs of having been roughly searched. Drawers had been emptied, furniture overturned, even floorboards pried up in places. They were very thorough, Samuel observed, looking around with detached interest. The tall man with the mustache said they would burn it all down if they had to. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. Pack a bag, Samuel. Only what you can carry. We're leaving. Where are we going? Samuel asked, already moving to obey with his usual efficiency. To find Sheriff Collins, Jake answered, then to Cheyenne. We have evidence that needs to reach the governor. Samuel nodded solemnly. Because of Papa's book, the one you found at the Eye. Yes, Margaret confirmed, surprised. How did you know that's where we went? It was the logical location based on the riddle, Samuel said simply. I considered going there myself, but calculated the climb would be too difficult for my height and strength. Jake raised an eyebrow at Margaret, impressed by the boy's reasoning. Smart kid. Too smart sometimes, Margaret murmured, but there was pride in her voice. They worked quickly, gathering essential supplies and the few valuables that hadn't been destroyed or stolen. The journal and documents were securely hidden inside Samuel's coat, beneath multiple layers. The association's men would be less likely to search a child thoroughly. As darkness fell completely, they prepared to leave. The temperature was dropping rapidly, stars appearing in the clear sky like chips of ice. We'll avoid the main roads, Jake said, checking his revolver one last time. Take the back trail through Peterson's property, then cut across to town. With luck, we can reach Collins by midnight. Margaret nodded, helping Samuel onto her horse before mounting behind him. The boy was silent, his face set in the expressionless mask he wore when processing difficult situations. She hugged him closer, wishing she could shield him from the harsh realities they faced. Ready? Jake asked, already in his saddle, despite the obvious pain it caused him. Before Margaret could answer, a flicker of movement caught her eye at the edge of the property. She stiffened, reaching for her rifle. Jake, she said quietly, we're being watched. He followed her gaze, his hand moving to his holster. How many? I saw movement by the eastern fence line. At least one, maybe more. Jake cursed under his breath. They've been waiting for us to return. Probably have the house surrounded. Samuel, ever observant, spoke up. The root cellar connects to the irrigation tunnel. Papa showed me. It comes out by the creek 400 yards east. Margaret and Jake exchanged surprised looks. An escape tunnel? Jake asked. Papa said every fort needs a secret exit, Samuel explained matter-of-factly. He built it last spring. A faint smile touched Margaret's lips. So like Thomas, to incorporate military strategy into a simple ranch house. Even in his darkest days, certain instincts had never left him. Samuel, you're a genius, Jake said, dismounting carefully. Show us where it is. The root cellar entrance was hidden beneath a trap door in the kitchen pantry. Below, rough-hewn steps led to a small chamber cut into the earth, where the ranch's winter provisions were stored. Samuel moved unerringly to the back wall, pushing aside several crates to reveal a narrow tunnel barely high enough for an adult to crawl through. Papa reinforced it with timber supports, Samuel explained. He made me practice evacuating through it 7 times. My best time was 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Jake examined the tunnel entrance with professional approval. Your father was a smart man. He glanced at Margaret. Ladies first. Margaret shook her head. Samuel goes first, then you. I'll bring up the rear. Jake looked like he wanted to argue, but recognized the protective instinct that would not be denied. Keep your rifle ready. If we get separated, head for Collins. Don't wait for us. The look Margaret gave him made it clear she had no intention of leaving anyone behind, but she nodded all the same. Samuel, with the practical adaptability of youth, was already removing his outer coat to fit more easily into the confined space. Stay close, Margaret instructed, helping him into the tunnel. Don't stop for anything. The boy disappeared into the darkness with remarkable speed, comfortable in the space he'd practiced traversing. Jake went next, moving awkwardly due to his wound, but managing all the same. Margaret took one last look around the home she'd fought so hard to keep, then followed them into the earth. The tunnel was a nightmare of close, damp walls and the smell of clay and rotting timber. Margaret forced herself forward, by focusing on the sound of Jake and Samuel ahead of her, refusing to acknowledge the weight of earth above, or the childhood fear of confined spaces that threatened to paralyze her. Samuel's 4 minutes felt like an eternity, but eventually Margaret felt a change in the air. Fresher, colder. Ahead, she could see Jake helping Samuel out through an opening partially concealed by brush along the creek bank. She had just reached the exit when the distant sound of gunfire erupted back at the house. Moments later, an orange glow lit the night sky. They're burning the house, Jake said grimly, pulling Margaret up the last few feet. Destroying evidence, sending a message. Margaret stood silent, watching her home. The place she'd shared with Thomas, where Samuel had taken his first steps. Consumed by flames. All those memories, all that work reduced to ash by men who valued power above all else. We need to move, Jake said, gently touching her arm. They'll check the barn, next find the tunnel entrance. Margaret nodded, her expression hardening into resolve. They'll pay for this, she said quietly. All of them. They will, Jake agreed. But first we need to survive to make that happen. Samuel, standing between them, reached up to take his mother's hand. His face showed none of the emotion a typical child might display at watching his home burn. Instead, his gray eyes reflected the distant flames with an almost analytical detachment. Papa said home isn't a place, he said suddenly. It's people who protect each other, so we still have a home. Margaret knelt and pulled him close, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. Yes, she whispered. We still have a home. Jake turned away, giving them a moment of privacy while scanning their surroundings for threats. The creek would provide some cover, but they needed to move quickly before the association's men organized a proper search. We should head west, he said finally. Away from town initially, then circle back. They'll expect us to go directly to Collins. Margaret stood, keeping Samuel close. I know a place. An old trapper's cabin in the foothills. Thomas and I stayed there our first winter before the house was built. How far? 5 miles. Difficult terrain, but that works in our favor. Hard to track, especially at night. Jake nodded. Lead the way. As they moved out, keeping to the shadows along the creek bank, Margaret glanced back one last time at the orange glow on the horizon. Everything she and Thomas had built, everything they'd sacrificed for, was being erased from existence. But they hadn't taken everything. She still had Samuel. She had Thomas's evidence. And she had an unexpected ally in Jake Ryland. Most importantly, she had the truth, and the determination to ensure it came to light whatever the cost. Behind them, the distant sound of men shouting indicated the tunnel had been discovered. The hunt was on. The trapper's cabin clung to the side of a wooded ridge like a barnacle to a ship's hull. Small, weathered, and nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Its single room was barely 10 feet square with a stone fireplace, a plank table, and a narrow bed frame covered with a straw-filled mattress. Margaret worked quickly to light a small fire while Jake secured the perimeter, checking sightlines and potential approaches. Samuel sat on an upturned crate, methodically inventorying their meager supplies with the precision that characterized all his actions. "We have food for approximately 36 hours, he reported. Ammunition for 17 shots from the Winchester 6 from Mr. Ryland's revolver. 1 medical kit, 3 blankets, and Papa's journal. Jake returned, stamping snow from his boots. "Place is well hidden. Hard to spot from below, good views of the approach trails." He nodded appreciatively. "Your husband chose well." "Thomas always thought strategically," Margaret said, stoking the small fire just enough for warmth without creating visible smoke. "Even before the war, it's why he was such a good officer." "And why he documented everything so meticulously," Jake added, gesturing to the journal now resting on the table. "Have you read through it all yet?" Margaret shook her head. "Only parts. Enough to know it contains evidence that could destroy the association." Jake removed his coat with a wince, his wound clearly troubling him, despite his attempts to hide it. "We should review it thoroughly. Understand exactly what we're dealing with before we take it to Collins." Samuel, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke. The tall man with the mustache, Mr. Canton, said Sheriff Collins couldn't be trusted. His gray eyes moved between the adults. He said the sheriff was playing both sides. Margaret and Jake exchanged concerned glances. "Did he say anything else about Sheriff Collins?" Jake asked carefully. Samuel's brow furrowed slightly as he accessed his perfect memory. "He said Collins thinks he's so clever keeping a foot in both camps. Wolcott's losing patience with his games." The boy recited the words verbatim, even mimicking Canton's drawling accent with uncanny accuracy. "That complicates things," Jake muttered, running a hand through his hair. "If Collins is compromised—" "We don't know that," Margaret interrupted. "Canton could have been lying, trying to create mistrust. Or Collins could be working both sides," Jake countered. "It wouldn't be the first time a lawman played a dangerous game." A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning through the pine trees that surrounded their hiding place. The fire popped and hissed, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. "We should read the journal," Margaret decided finally. "All of it. Thomas might have mentioned Collins, given us some indication of where his loyalties truly lie." The next hour was spent poring over Thomas Sullivan's meticulous documentation of the association's activities. The journal revealed a pattern of intimidation, corruption, and violence spanning years. Falsified land claims, bribed officials, rustlers hired to steal from small ranchers to justify retribution. Most damning were the detailed accounts of meetings where the cleansing of Johnson County was openly discussed. "Here," Margaret said, pointing to an entry dated 3 months before Thomas's death. "He mentions Collins." Jake leaned closer to read the neat handwriting. "February 12, 1889. Met Collins at the South Ridge." He's walking a dangerous line, pretending loyalty to the association while secretly gathering evidence against them. I fear for him. These are not men who forgive betrayal. He asked me to document everything said together. We might build a case strong enough to bring federal intervention. I agreed, though I wonder if we're both fools tilting at windmills. So Collins was working against the association, Margaret said, relief evident in her voice. He was trying to help. Jake didn't look convinced. Or he was playing your husband, using him to gather information while maintaining his cover with the association. He tapped the page. Keep reading. Is there anything more recent? Margaret turned several pages forward, scanning the entries until she found another mention of the sheriff. April 1st, 1889. Collins brought disturbing news. The association has compiled what they're calling the blacklist, names of those to be eliminated when their operation begins. My name appears at the top along with Margaret's. They know I've been documenting their activities. Collins believes there's a spy, someone close to us, feeding information back to Wolcott. He urged me to hide my journal somewhere secure and to prepare for the worst. A spy, Jake repeated grimly. Someone in your circle. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. Neighbors, friends, the few people they'd trusted. Who would betray us like that? Someone with something to gain, or something to lose. Jake turned to the final entries in the journal, the ones written in the days immediately preceding Thomas's death. The last entry, dated the day before he died, was particularly disturbing. April 28, 1889. Wolcott came today. No pretense of friendship this time. Direct threats against Margaret and Samuel if I don't surrender my evidence and leave the territory. He knows about the journal, mentioned details I've told no one except Collins. God help me. I fear James has betrayed us after all, or been broken. I've hidden the journal where even Margaret won't think to look. If anything happens to me, the truth must survive. For justice, for my family. Margaret sat back, her face pale. He suspected Collins had betrayed him. But he wasn't certain, Jake pointed out. And the timing is suspicious. The very next day, Thomas is dead. If Collins is the traitor, why would he hire you to investigate? Margaret challenged. Why risk exposing himself? To control the investigation. To make sure it led nowhere. Jake's expression was troubled. Or perhaps because he's genuinely trying to atone for a mistake. Samuel, who had been listening silently, suddenly spoke. Papa told me once that people are complicated, that sometimes good people do bad things for what they think are good reasons. He looked up at his mother with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. He said that about himself when he talked about the war. Margaret reached out to smooth his hair, a rare gesture of affection that Samuel accepted without his usual stiffness. Your father was a wise man, Samuel. So what now? Jake asked. Collins might be our ally, or he might be the very person who got Thomas killed. Either way, we need to get this evidence to someone with the authority to act on it. Governor Warren, Margaret said decisively. Thomas trusted him, said he was one of the few men in power who couldn't be bought. Jake nodded slowly. Cheyenne's 3 days' hard ride from here in good weather. In this, he gestured toward the window where snow had begun falling again. Could take longer, and they'll be watching the roads. Then, we don't take the roads, Margaret said simply. We go cross-country, through the high passes. Jake's eyebrows shot up. In winter? That's suicide, Margaret. Not if you know the way. She leaned forward, her expression determined. Before we homesteaded, Thomas and I worked as guides for a season. We know trails through the mountains that don't appear on any map. Even so, it's dangerous, especially with Samuel. At the mention of his name, the boy looked up. I can do it, he said with the simple certainty of a child who hasn't yet learned to doubt his capabilities. Papa taught me winter survival techniques. I know how to read weather patterns and avoid avalanche conditions. Jake looked between mother and son, seeing the same stubborn resolve in both faces. All right, he conceded. But we rest tonight. I'll take first watch. Your wound needs tending first, Margaret countered, already reaching for the medical kit. And don't argue. You're no good to us if infection sets in. Jake submitted to her ministrations with reluctant grace, removing his shirt to reveal the bullet wound in his side. It looked angry and inflamed, the edges beginning to show the red streaks that signaled infection. Margaret cleaned it carefully, applying a poultice of herbs from the medical kit and rebandaging it with strips of clean cloth. Her touch was efficient, but gentle, professional, yet intimate by necessity. Jake watched her face as she worked, noting the concentration in her gray eyes, the slight furrow between her brows. "You've done this before," he observed. "Too many times," she replied without looking up. "Ranching isn't for the faint of heart or weak of stomach. Thomas was lucky to have you." Margaret's hands stilled momentarily. "I was lucky to have him," she said quietly. "Despite his demons. Despite everything." A silence fell between them, filled with unspoken thoughts. Samuel had curled up on the narrow bed, his breathing already deep and regular. The ability to sleep anywhere, anytime being one of his practical talents. "Tell me about him," Jake said suddenly. "Thomas, the man, not the soldier." Margaret finished bandaging his wound before answering. "He was brilliant. Like Samuel, but different. Thomas saw patterns in everything. Weather, markets, people. He could read a situation, instantly anticipate moves 3 steps ahead." "Sounds like Samuel got his intelligence from both parents," Jake commented, pulling his shirt back on. Margaret smiled faintly. "Thomas was also stubborn, principled to a fault. He believed in justice, in doing what was right even when it was difficult." Her smile faded. The war changed him. He came back with nightmares, with a darkness that hadn't been there before. But underneath it all, he was still the man I married, still fighting for what he believed in. Even at the end, especially then. Margaret's voice grew stronger. Whatever the association might claim, Thomas didn't take his own life out of weakness or fear. If he was murdered, it was because he refused to be silenced. Jake studied her face in the firelight. "You're a lot like him. That same courage. That same refusal to surrender." Margaret looked away, uncomfortable with the admiration in his gaze. "Get some rest. I'll take first watch." "I can—" "You're injured and you need sleep to heal," she cut him off firmly. "I'll wake you in 4 hours." Jake wanted to argue, but knew it would be futile. He settled himself on the floor near the fire, using his saddle as a pillow. 4 hours, not a minute more. Margaret nodded, checking her Winchester one more time before taking up position near the window. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing their tracks, and transforming the landscape into a featureless white void. It would make travel difficult come morning, but it also provided a temporary cover, hiding them from those who sought to silence them as they had silenced Thomas. Jake woke to the sound of Samuel's voice, pitched low but urgent. "Mr. Ryland, wake up! Someone's coming!" He was instantly alert, hand moving to his revolver as he rose silently to his feet. Margaret was already at the window, Winchester ready, her face tense in the gray pre-dawn light. "How many?" Jake whispered, joining her. "At least 3, maybe more," she replied, her breath fogging the glass. "Coming up the eastern trail." Jake peered out, squinting against the gloom. The snow had stopped, leaving behind a pristine white landscape, broken only by a line of dark figures ascending the ridge. Even at this distance, he could see they were armed. "Canton," Jake muttered, recognizing the lead rider's distinctive silhouette. "And that's Tom Horn behind him. They've brought their best tracker." "How did they find us?" Margaret asked, voice tight with controlled fear. Jake's expression was grim. "They didn't need to track us through the snow. Someone told them where to look." "Collins? Or someone else who knew about this cabin?" Jake checked his revolver, counting the bullets. "They'll have the place surrounded within minutes. We need to move now." Margaret nodded, already gathering their meager supplies. "Samuel, get your coat. Remember the escape route we discussed." The boy nodded solemnly, bundling the precious journal inside his shirt before donning his coat. Northwest descent followed the creek bed to the Box Canyon, then up through the narrow pass. "That's right." Margaret knelt before him, gripping his shoulders. "If we get separated, you keep going. Find a place to hide and wait for me, but only until sunset. If I don't come by then—" "Mama," Samuel interrupted with unusual force, "we stay together." Margaret's eyes glistened briefly before she regained her composure. "Yes, together." She straightened, addressing Jake. "There's a back way out, a narrow gap between the rocks behind the fireplace. It leads to a ledge that drops down to the western slope." Jake nodded, already moving to the fireplace. "You go first with Samuel. I'll cover your retreat." "Jake, no arguments," he cut her off. "I'll be right behind you." Margaret hesitated, then reached out to squeeze his arm briefly before ushering Samuel toward the hidden exit. The gap was barely visible, concealed by shadows and the rough construction of the fireplace. One by one, they slipped through, emerging onto a narrow ledge that clung to the ridge face. Below them, the western slope fell away, steeply covered in fresh snow that gleamed in the growing light. The descent would be treacherous, but it offered their only chance of escape. "Stay close to the rock face," Margaret instructed Samuel. "Test each step before putting your weight on it." They began the precarious journey downward, using small shrubs and rock outcroppings for handholds. Above them, they could hear voices as the association's men reached the cabin. Then a shout. They'd been discovered missing. "Move faster," Jake urged from just behind them. "They'll check the perimeter any second." As if summoned by his words, a figure appeared at the edge of the ledge above them. "Here! They're here!" the man shouted, raising his rifle. Jake fired first, his revolver roaring in the still morning air. The man jerked backward, disappearing from view with a cry. But the damage was done, their position revealed. "Run!" Jake pushed Margaret and Samuel ahead of him as bullets began to strike the rocks around them, sending fragments flying. They abandoned caution for speed, half sliding, half falling down the snowy slope. Samuel stumbled, and Margaret caught him, pulling him back to his feet without breaking stride. Jake brought up the rear, turning occasionally to fire at their pursuers, more to slow them down than with any real hope of hitting them at this distance. The slope ended abruptly at a line of dense pines. They plunged into the trees, the sudden dimness disorienting after the bright snow. Behind them, they could hear men shouting, horses crashing through underbrush. "The creek is just ahead," Margaret gasped, pulling Samuel along. "If we can reach it—" A shot rang out closer than the others. Margaret cried out, stumbling, as a bullet grazed her arm. Blood bloomed bright against her coat sleeve. "Mama?" Samuel's voice held more emotion than Jake had yet heard from the stoic boy. "I'm all right," Margaret insisted, though her face had gone pale. "Keep moving." Jake moved to support her with one arm while keeping his revolver ready in the other hand. "How bad?" "Just a graze. Don't slow down." They pushed on, the sound of pursuit growing louder behind them. The trees thinned, revealing a steep ravine with a half-frozen creek at its bottom. The descent looked nearly impossible, a jumble of sharp rocks, arms, and ice-slick surfaces. "There's no way down," Jake said, scanning for alternatives. "Yes, there is." Samuel pointed to a barely visible game trail that zigzagged down the ravine face. "Papa showed me. The deer use it in winter." Without waiting for confirmation, the boys started down the trail with the sure-footed confidence of youth. Margaret and Jake followed, moving as quickly as they dared on the treacherous path. They were halfway down when Tom Horn emerged from the trees above them. The legendary tracker didn't shout, didn't waste time with warnings. He simply raised his Sharps rifle and took careful aim. Jake saw the movement from the corner of his eye and reacted instinctively, shoving Margaret and Samuel flat against the ravine wall, as Horn's bullet screamed past them, shattering a rock inches from Jake's head. Horn was already reloading his movements, practiced and efficient. Jake raised his revolver, knowing the distance was extreme for a handgun, but having no choice. He steadied his breathing, took careful aim, and fired. The shot was impossibly lucky, or perhaps guided by the hand of whatever justice Thomas Sullivan had believed in. Horn jerked backward, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air as he lost his footing on the ravine edge. For a moment, he teetered there, arms windmilling, then plunged forward, tumbling down the rocky face with bone-breaking force. His body came to rest on a ledge 30 feet below their position, unmoving. "Is he?" Margaret began. "Don't look." Jake cut her off, ushering them forward. "Just keep moving." They reached the creek bed minutes later, their pursuers momentarily thrown into confusion by Horn's fall. The creek offered a path forward, its partially frozen surface breaking loudly beneath their feet as they ran. "The box canyon is just ahead." Margaret panted, her wounded arm held tight against her body. "Once we're through the pass, we'll be on the western slope. They'll have a harder time tracking us there." Jake glanced back. No immediate signs of pursuit, but that wouldn't last. Canton was no fool. He'd reorganize quickly, especially after losing Horn. And unlike Horn, Canton wouldn't care about taking them alive. The box canyon rose around them like the walls of a fortress, sheer rock faces streaked with ice, narrowing to a shadowed cleft at the far end. The pass Samuel had mentioned. It looked barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways, let alone a horse. "They won't be able to follow on horseback," Margaret confirmed, reading his thoughts. "That's why Thomas and I used this route. It forces pursuers to continue on foot, giving us a chance to widen the lead." They pushed forward, the canyon walls blocking much of the morning light, casting them into premature dusk. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, the air growing sharp with cold. Samuel moved with surprising energy, his small form navigating the rocky terrain with the adaptability of youth. The pass, when they reached it, was even narrower than it had appeared. A jagged slash in the rock face that looked like it had been carved by a giant's axe. Samuel slipped through easily. Margaret followed with more difficulty, her wounded arm hampering her movements. Jake, broader in the shoulders, had to turn sideways and inch through the rough stone scraping against his back and chest. They emerged onto a wind-swept ledge that offered a breathtaking view of the western valleys, miles of pristine wilderness stretching toward the distant mountains that marked the border with Idaho territory. In summer, it would have been beautiful. In winter, it was a frozen wasteland that promised both salvation and death. "We can follow the ridge line south," Margaret said, her breath forming thick clouds in the frigid air. "There's a trading post about 15 miles from here. The owner, Jeremiah Tucker, was a friend of Thomas's. He'll help us." Jake nodded, though his expression was troubled. 15 miles in this terrain will take all day. And your arm needs attention." "It can wait," Margaret insisted, though the sleeve of her coat was now soaked with blood. "No, It can't, Jake countered firmly. Infection sets in fast in these temperatures. We need shelter fire and clean bandages. Then we can continue. Samuel, who had been scanning the landscape with his characteristic methodical attention, suddenly pointed. Smoke, 2 miles southwest, approximately. Jake followed his gesture and saw it, a faint plume rising against the pale sky. Could be a trapper, or a hunting party. Or association men, Margaret added grimly. Only one way to find out. Jake checked his revolver. 2 bullets remaining. We need supplies, and you need medical attention. It's worth the risk. Margaret hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Samuel stays hidden until we determine it's safe. Agreed. Jake turned to the boy. Samuel, if anything happens to us, you keep going south. Find Tucker. Give him the journal and tell him everything. Can you do that? Samuel's gray eyes, so like his mother's, met Jake's steadily. I can, but nothing will happen to you or Mama. The statistical probability of our collective survival increases by 42.7% if we remain together. Despite the gravity of their situation, Jake felt a smile tug at his lips. Where did you come up with that figure? I calculated it, Samuel replied matter-of-factly, based on observed variables and historical precedents. Jake exchanged a look with Margaret, whose own lips had curved slightly upward despite her pain. Can't argue with those odds, he said, ruffling the boy's hair, a gesture Samuel accepted with unusual tolerance. Let's go find out who's making that smoke. The source of the smoke proved to be a small cabin tucked into a protected hollow, its chimney sending gray tendrils skyward against the white landscape. They approached cautiously, Jake and Margaret, leaving Samuel concealed in a dense stand of pine while they reconnoitered. No horses were visible, no tracks except those of small game around the cabin's perimeter. A single wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting a carefully banked fire rather than active occupation. Wait here, Jake whispered, drawing his revolver. I'll check inside. Margaret shook her head, Winchester already in hand despite her injured arm. Together. He wanted to argue, but recognized the futility. They approached the cabin from different angles, moving silently through the snow. At the door, Jake positioned himself to one side, while Margaret covered him, then rapped sharply on the weathered wood. No response. Jake tried again, louder. Still nothing. Carefully, he tested the door. It swung open with a protesting creak, revealing a dim interior lit only by the glow of embers in the fireplace. The cabin appeared empty, a single room with a rough bed table and several shelves of supplies. "Hello," Jake called, stepping inside with his revolver ready. "Anyone here?" Nothing but the soft pop of the dying fire. He signaled to Margaret that it was clear, and she joined him, closing the door against the bitter cold. "Trapper's cabin," she observed, looking around, recently occupied, but abandoned in a hurry. She pointed to a half-eaten meal on the table, now frozen solid. They left suddenly, within the last day or so. Jake nodded, holstering his revolver as he examined the cabin more thoroughly. It was well stocked with provisions, dried meat beans, coffee, even some medical supplies. A stroke of desperately needed luck. "Get Samuel," he said. "I'll build up the fire." Within minutes, the cabin was warming, and Samuel was methodically organizing their newfound supplies while Jake tended to Margaret's wound. The bullet had carved a deep furrow along her upper arm, painful but not life-threatening if properly cleaned and bandaged. "You were lucky," Jake commented, as he worked applying a poultice of herbs he'd found among the trapper's supplies. "An inch to the left, and it would have hit bone." Margaret winced as he tightened the bandage. Luck had nothing to do with it. Horn's a better shot than that. He was aiming to wound, not kill. "They want us alive." They want the journal, she corrected. And they need us to tell them where it is. Jake's expression darkened at the implication. Horn's reputation for extracting information was legendary and brutal. All the more reason to keep moving as soon as you're patched up. Samuel, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke from his position by the window. Horses. 3 riders approaching from the east. Jake and Margaret exchanged alarmed glances. They'd been found somehow. Jake moved to the window, staying carefully to one side as he peered out. 3 men on horseback were indeed approaching their mounts, struggling through the deep snow. But it wasn't Canton and his men. The lead rider was Sheriff James Collins. "It's Collins," Jake said, tension evident in his voice, "with 2 deputies I don't recognize." Margaret joined him at the window, her face hardening as she recognized the sheriff. "Friend or foe?" "We're about to find out." Jake checked his revolver one last time. "Samuel, get in the root cellar. Don't come out unless your mother or I call for you." The boy hesitated, looking to his mother for confirmation. At her nod, he moved to the small trapdoor in the floor, slipping into the darkness below, with the precious journal still secured inside his coat. Jake positioned himself to the side of the door, revolver ready, while Margaret took up position behind the table, her Winchester trained on the entrance. A knock came, followed by Collins's voice. "Margaret, Jake, I know you're in there. We need to talk." Jake and Margaret exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Jake called out, "Step into the open, Sheriff, alone, hands where we can see them." A pause. Then, "All right, I'm coming in, don't shoot." The door opened slowly, and Sheriff Collins entered, his hands held away from his gun belt. His face was haggard, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep or excess of worry, perhaps both. "Thank God you're alive," he said, relief evident in his voice. "When we found your ranch burned—" "Who's we?" Jake interrupted, not lowering his weapon. "And who are those men outside?" "Deputies from Cheyenne," Collins explained. "Governor Warren sent them when I telegraphed about the situation." He looked between them, noting their suspicious expressions. "I'm on your side. I always have been." "Thomas's journal suggests otherwise," Margaret said coldly. "His last entry questions your loyalty." Collins winced as if struck. "I know, and I can't blame him for his doubts. I've been walking a dangerous line, Margaret, pretending to cooperate with the association while gathering evidence against them." "Convenient explanation," Jake observed. "And why should we believe you?" Collins reached slowly into his coat, freezing when both Jake and Margaret tensed. "Easy. I'm just getting something you need to see." Carefully, he withdrew a folded paper and held it out. "From Governor Warren, authorization for federal intervention if sufficient evidence is presented." Jake took the paper without lowering his revolver, scanning it quickly. It appeared genuine. The governor's letterhead, his distinctive signature. "This proves nothing," he said, though doubt had begun to creep into his voice. "You could have forged this." "I could have," Collins acknowledged. "I could also have brought Canton and his men straight to your door instead of deputies loyal to the governor." He sighed heavily. "Thomas was my friend, Margaret. I failed him. I wasn't there when he needed me most, but I'm trying to make it right." Margaret's grip on the Winchester hadn't wavered. "Then explain why Thomas suspected you of betraying him to Wolcott." "Because I told Wolcott enough to maintain his trust," Collins admitted. "Small things, unimportant details, but I never told him about the journal. Never." His face creased with genuine anguish. "I didn't know Wolcott was planning to kill Thomas. By the time I found out, it was too late." A heavy silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, whistling around the eaves with mournful intensity. "Tom Horn is dead," Jake said finally. "He fell trying to stop us at the ravine." Collins's eyes widened. "That changes things. Horn was Canton's best man. Without him, they might delay their operation." "Or accelerate it," Margaret countered. "Cut their losses and proceed with the main plan." Collins nodded grimly. "Either way, we need to get Thomas's evidence to Cheyenne immediately. Governor Warren has agreed to meet us, but only if we come directly to him, bypassing the territorial officials who might be in the association's pocket." Jake and Margaret exchanged looks, a silent communication that had developed with surprising speed during their short time together. Finally, Margaret nodded slightly. "Samuel," she called softly, "you can come out now." The trapdoor lifted, and Samuel emerged, his face characteristically expressionless as he regarded Sheriff Collins. "Hello, Uncle James," he said with formal politeness. "Your left eyelid is twitching at a rate of approximately once every 4.2 seconds. Papa said that happens when you're worried or not telling the whole truth." Collins blinked in surprise, then smiled sadly. "Your father knew me too well, Samuel, and so do you." He knelt to the boy's level. "I am worried, and there are things I haven't told your mother and Mr. Ryland yet, but not because I'm lying, because there hasn't been time." "What things?" Jake demanded, his suspicion rekindled. Collins stood, his expression grave. "The association has moved up its timetable. They've brought in 50 men from Texas. Gunfighters, former Rangers, hired killers. They're gathering at the TA Ranch as we speak. And they've expanded their black list to include every small rancher in Johnson County." "When?" Margaret asked, her face pale. 3 days, maybe less." Collins looked from Margaret to Jake, his expression deadly serious. "We have that long to get Thomas's evidence to the governor and convince him to send federal troops. Otherwise, Johnson County is going to become a killing field." The journey to Cheyenne began before dawn, in a swirling ground blizzard that covered their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. Collins had brought extra horses, sturdy mountain ponies accustomed to the harsh Wyoming winters. Margaret rode with Samuel before her in the saddle, the boy tucked inside her coat for warmth. Jake and Collins rode flanking positions with the 2 deputies, Simmons and Hale, taking point and rear guard. They traveled cross-country, avoiding the main trails and settlements where association men might be watching. The going was painfully slow, the horses struggling through snow that sometimes reached their chests in the deeper drifts. By midday, they had covered barely 10 miles, and the weather showed no signs of improvement. "We need to find shelter before dark," Collins called over the howling wind. "Temperature's dropping. We'll freeze if we're caught in the open." Jake nodded grimly, pulling his scarf tighter around his face. His wound throbbed with each movement of his horse, the cold seeping into his bones despite the layers of clothing. Beside him, Margaret's face was pale with fatigue and pain, though she made no complaint. "There's a line camp about 3 miles southeast," Collins continued. "Wyoming Central Railroad property. Should be stocked with provisions." They altered course, following the sheriff through a narrow draw that provided some shelter from the relentless wind. The landscape had transformed into an alien world of white, featureless, disorienting, hostile to human life. Samuel, usually so stoic, had begun to shiver violently despite the protection of his mother's coat. The line camp appeared just as the early winter dusk began to fall. A small cabin with a large stable attached, used by railroad workers, maintaining the tracks in this isolated stretch. Deputy Simmons rode ahead to check for occupants or threats, returning with a nod that signaled the all-clear. Inside the cabin was basic but sound. A single room with bunks along one wall, a pot-bellied stove in the center, and shelves stocked with provisions. They worked quickly to establish a perimeter stable, the horses and get a fire started in the stove. "We're making poor time," Collins observed, spreading a map on the rough table once they'd settled. "At this rate, it'll take 4 days to reach Cheyenne. We don't have 4 days." "Could we reach the railroad?" Jake suggested, studying the map. "Intercept a train." Collins shook his head. "Nearest station is Arlington, 30 miles south, and the association controls the station master there." Margaret, who had been quietly tending to Samuel by the stove, joined them at the table. "What about Telegraph Gap? It's closer than Arlington, and there's a telegraph office there." "Controlled by the association," Collins said grimly, "like most communications in the territory." "But if we could get a message through directly to the governor," Margaret persisted. Jake's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Collins, those deputies you brought, are they truly loyal to the governor?" "Hale and Simmons, absolutely. Warren sent them personally." "Then we split up," Jake decided. "2 parties moving toward Cheyenne by different routes, one carrying the actual journal, one carrying a decoy. If the association is watching the roads, they'll have to divide their forces to pursue both." Collins considered this, tracing potential routes on the map. "It could work, but who goes where?" "I'll take the journal with Samuel," Margaret said firmly. "Collins and 1 deputy can accompany us on the eastern route through the foothills, while I take the western route with the other deputy, making a more visible target," Jake finished. "Draw their attention away from you." "No," Margaret's gray eyes flashed with unusual emotion. "That's too dangerous, Jake. They'll kill you if they catch you without the journal." "Better me than you and Samuel," he countered. A heavy silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the howling wind outside and the soft crackling of the fire. Samuel, who had been listening with his characteristic quiet attentiveness, suddenly spoke. "The statistical probability of success decreases by 57.2% if we separate," he said matter-of-factly, "and increases by 38.6% if we utilize alternative transportation." The adults turned to look at the boy who stood by the stove, his thin face serious in the flickering light. "What alternative transportation, Samuel?" Collins asked gently. "The railroad maintenance handcar," Samuel replied, pointing out the window toward a small shed partially buried in snow. "Standard equipment at all line camps, capable of speeds up to 15 miles per hour on clear track. The line runs directly to Cheyenne." Jake exchanged a surprised look with Collins. "The boy's right. A handcar could cut our travel time significantly." "If the tracks are clear," Collins cautioned, "and if the association isn't watching the rails." "They'll be expecting us to travel by horse," Margaret pointed out. "The handcar gives us an advantage they won't anticipate." Jake moved to the window, peering out at the shed Samuel had indicated. "How did you know about the handcar, Samuel?" The boy shrugged slightly, a rare gesture of informality. "Papa brought me here once. He said a good strategist always knows all available resources and escape routes." A brief smile touched Margaret's lips, gone almost before it appeared. "Thomas was thorough in his lessons." "That he was?" Collins agreed with a sad smile of his own. "Always thinking 3 steps ahead." Jake turned back from the window, his expression resolute. "The handcar it is, then. We'll leave at first light. With luck, we can reach Cheyenne by tomorrow night." As the others began making preparations, checking supplies, and planning the route, Jake pulled Collins aside. "I need to know something," he said quietly, his voice too low for the others to hear. "If Thomas suspected you had betrayed him, why did he continue to trust you with information?" Collins's weathered face showed a flash of pain before settling back into its usual stoic lines. "Because he knew me too well, knew I might bend, but never break." He sighed heavily. "I told Wolcott enough to maintain my cover, minor details, things that wouldn't endanger Thomas directly. But Wolcott was cleverer than I gave him credit for. He pieced together the fragments, realized Thomas was documenting everything. So Thomas was right to suspect you. Yes, Collins admitted, and that knowledge will haunt me for the rest of my days. But I never intended for him to die, Jake. You have to believe that. Jake studied the older man's face, searching for deception, and finding only grief and regret. I believe you didn't want him dead, he said finally. But your actions helped make it possible. Collins nodded, accepting the judgment without defense. And that's why I'll do whatever it takes to ensure his death wasn't in vain. To protect Margaret and Samuel. To see justice done. Before Jake could respond, Deputy Simmons burst through the door, snow swirling around him as he stamped his boots on the threshold. Riders, he reported tersely. Coming from the north. At least 6, maybe more. Association men, Collins demanded. Can't be sure in this weather, but they're armed and moving with purpose. Jake moved quickly to the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. In the fading light, he could just make out dark shapes moving through the swirling snow, perhaps a half-mile distant. How did they find us so quickly? Margaret asked, instinctively moving to stand protectively near Samuel. Horn might have gotten a message out before his fall, Collins suggested. Or they're following a parallel search pattern, checking all potential shelters. Doesn't matter now, Jake said grimly. We need to move. The handcar. Can we use it in the dark? Collins exchanged glances with his deputies. It's risky. Without being able to see obstacles on the track, we have no choice. Jake cut him off. If they're association men, they won't take prisoners. Not after Horn. A moment of tense silence followed as the implications sank in. Then Collins nodded decisively. Simmons, Hale, get the handcar ready. We'll cover your tracks to the shed. He turned to Margaret. Get Samuel bundled up. Take only what you can carry. They moved with urgent efficiency, gathering the essential supplies, dousing the fire, and obliterating all signs of their presence. Jake checked his revolver. Collins had provided additional ammunition from his own supplies and positioned himself at the window to monitor the approaching riders. They've stopped, he reported after a few minutes. Dismounted, sending 2 men forward on foot. Scouts, Collins muttered. Standard association tactics. We have maybe 15 minutes before they reach the cabin. The handcar's ready, Simmons announced, returning with snow covering his coat. Track looks clear as far as we can see, but visibility's poor. It'll have to do, Collins decided. Jake, you and Margaret go with Simmons. I'll follow with Samuel and Hale once you're clear. No, Margaret said firmly. Samuel stays with me. Collins started to argue, then saw the determination in her eyes, and nodded. All right. Jake, you and I will go last, cover your retreat if necessary. They moved out through the back door, keeping low and using the stable for cover as they made their way to the shed where the handcar waited. The wind had picked up again, driving snow horizontally across the landscape and reducing visibility to mere yards. A mixed blessing. It concealed their movement, but made navigation treacherous. The maintenance shed was little more than a lean-to protecting the track from snow accumulation. Inside the handcar sat on the rails, a simple platform with a seesaw lever mechanism for propulsion. It looked weathered, but serviceable. It'll hold 4 comfortably, 5 at a squeeze, Simmons explained. But the more weight, the harder to pump. Margaret, Samuel, and Hale go first, Collins decided. Jake and I will follow with Simmons on the second trip. There won't be time for a second trip, Jake said, glancing back toward the cabin where lights now showed. The association men had arrived and were searching the building. We all go now. 6 is too many, Simmons protested. The car won't. It'll have to, Jake cut him off. Margaret Samuel, on the car. Now. They scrambled to obey, positioning themselves on the platform, while Hale and Simmons took the main pumping positions. Collins helped Samuel secure himself, then turned to Jake. "You're right," he said quietly. "No time for a second trip. Which is why you're going, and I'm staying." Before Jake could protest, Collins pressed something into his hand, his badge. "Give this to Governor Warren. Tell him James Collins did his duty in the end." "James, someone has to slow them down," Collins interrupted. "Give you time to get clear." His eyes held a steady resolve. "I owe Thomas this much, at least." A shout from the direction of the cabin indicated they'd been discovered. Collins drew his revolver and positioned himself at the shed entrance. "Go," he ordered. "Get that journal to Cheyenne. It's Wyoming's only hope." Jake hesitated just a moment longer, then squeezed the older man's shoulder once before jumping onto the handcar. "I'll make sure they know what you did here." Collins nodded, his face set in grim lines. "Take care of them, Jake. They're special, those two." With a final nod, Jake joined the others on the handcar. Hale and Simmons began pumping the lever, and the car lurched forward, gathering speed as it emerged from the shed onto the open track. Behind them, gunfire erupted as Collins engaged the approaching association men. The handcar picked up speed, the rhythmic clack of wheels on rails barely audible over the howling wind. Jake joined Hale and Simmons at the pumping lever, ignoring the pain that flared in his wounded side with each movement. Margaret huddled with Samuel at the front of the platform, shielding him from the worst of the wind and flying snow. They had gone perhaps a quarter-mile when a final volley of gunfire echoed across the white landscape, followed by silence. No one spoke, but they all knew what it meant. Sheriff James Collins would not be following. Dawn broke with painful slowness, the eastern sky grudgingly yielding bands of pink and gold through breaking clouds. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white, broken only by the straight line of the railroad tracks stretching toward the horizon. The handcar had made good progress through the darkness, the men taking turns at the pumping mechanism, while Margaret kept watch for obstacles or pursuers. Samuel had eventually fallen asleep, exhaustion overcoming even his remarkable stamina. They stopped briefly at sunrise, stretching cramped muscles and sharing the meager provisions they'd brought from the line camp. Jake used the opportunity to scan their back trail with Collins's field glasses. "No sign of pursuit yet," he reported, though his expression remained vigilant. "But that doesn't mean they're not coming." "How much further to Cheyenne?" Margaret asked gently, rousing Samuel and ensuring he ate something. Deputy Hale consulted a small railroad map he carried. "About 60 miles. If we maintain our current pace and the track remains clear, we could reach the outskirts by nightfall." "And if they're watching the approaches to the city?" Jake asked. "Governor Warren has men he trusts," Simmons spoke up. "Once we're within 15 miles of Cheyenne, I know back routes we can use to reach the governor's mansion undetected." Jake nodded, not entirely convinced, but seeing no alternative. "We should keep moving. Every minute counts." They resumed their journey, the men settling into a rhythm at the pump lever, while Margaret kept Samuel occupied by having him calculate their speed and estimated arrival time, a task he approached with characteristic precision. The landscape gradually changed as they moved southward, the rugged mountains giving way to rolling hills, the snow cover thinning as they lost elevation. By midday, they had reached the North Platte River Valley, the tracks running parallel to the partially frozen waterway. "We're making good time," Hale observed during a brief rest. "Better than I expected." Jake, who had been scanning the horizon again, suddenly tensed. "We've got company." In the distance, a plume of black smoke was visible against the blue sky, a locomotive approaching from the south, moving rapidly on the same track they occupied. "Regular passenger service isn't scheduled through here today," Simmons said, his expression concerned. "Must be a special." "Or association men," Jake concluded grimly. "We need to clear the track." They quickly manhandled the handcar off the rails and into the shelter of a small copse of cottonwoods that grew along the riverbank. From this vantage point, they could observe the approaching train without being immediately visible. The locomotive appeared minutes later, a powerful Baldwin engine pulling just 3 cars. Not a regular passenger service, but a private train. As it drew closer, Jake could make out armed men on the platforms between cars. "Association," he confirmed. "Moving men north, probably reinforcements for the operation." "Can we go around them?" Margaret asked, keeping Samuel close. "Not on the tracks," Hale replied. "But there's a wagon road that follows the river. Rougher going, but it would get us to Cheyenne eventually." "On foot?" Jake shook his head. "Too slow. We need to stay on the rails if we're going to reach the governor in time." They watched in tense silence as the train passed their position, slowing as it approached a water tower about a half-mile ahead. The locomotive came to a stop, the crew disembarking to refill the water tanks and check the machinery. "This might be our only chance," Jake said suddenly. "That train's headed to Cheyenne after it finishes the run north. If we could get on board, stow away on a train full of association men." Simmons looked at him incredulously. "That's suicide." "Not if we do it right," Jake insisted. "The rear car. It looks like a private coach. Probably Wolcott's or one of the other association leaders. If we could get aboard while they're stopped." Margaret studied the train with calculating eyes. "The crew is focused on the locomotive. The guards seem concentrated on the middle car, probably where the majority of their men are quartered." "Exactly," Jake nodded. "The rear car will have minimal security, especially during a maintenance stop." Deputy Hale looked skeptical. "Even if we get aboard, how do we remain undetected all the way to Cheyenne?" "We don't need to," Jake explained. "We just need to get close enough to make a break for the governor's mansion. Once the train slows approaching Cheyenne, we can jump off." "It's risky," Simmons cautioned. "Everything about this situation is risky," Margaret countered. "But Jake's right. It may be our best chance to reach Cheyenne in time." Samuel, who had been observing the train with his usual methodical attention, spoke up. "The rear car has an external platform with a door. Standard Pullman design. The door will likely be unlocked during a stop to allow passengers access to the facilities." The adults looked at him in surprise, and the boy shrugged slightly. "Papa had books on railroad engineering. I memorized them." "Of course you did," Jake said with a brief smile. "All right, here's the plan. Simmons, you and Hale create a distraction at the front of the train. Nothing obvious, just enough to draw attention away from the rear car. Margaret, Samuel, and I will board while everyone's looking the other way." "And if you're discovered?" Hale asked. Jake's expression hardened. "Then you two continue to Cheyenne on foot with this." He handed the journal to Simmons. "We'll keep a decoy with us. If we're caught, the real evidence still gets through." Margaret started to protest, then stopped, recognizing the logic of the arrangement. After a moment's hesitation, she reached into Samuel's coat and retrieved the journal, handing it to Simmons, while keeping the outer wrapping, which they could stuff with blank pages to create a convincing fake. "Be careful with that," she said quietly. "It cost my husband his life." Simmons nodded solemnly, securing the journal inside his coat. "We won't fail you, Mrs. Sullivan." They waited until the train crew was fully engaged with the water tank operations then moved cautiously through the riverside brush toward their positions. Hale and Simmons circled toward the front of the train, while Jake led Margaret and Samuel toward the rear car. "Stay low," he whispered as they used a slight embankment for cover. "Wait for the distraction before making a move." They didn't have to wait long. A sudden commotion erupted near the locomotive. Hale and Simmons had apparently spooked several horses grazing nearby, causing them to stampede across the tracks in front of the train. The crew and guards rushed to prevent a collision. Attention focused entirely forward. "Now," Jake urged, leading Margaret and Samuel in a crouched run toward the rear car's platform. They reached it without being spotted, pressing themselves against the car's side as Jake carefully tested the door. It opened silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing a luxuriously appointed interior. He ushered Margaret and Samuel inside, quickly following and closing the door behind them with barely a sound. The private car was empty, its plush furnishings speaking of wealth and power. A sitting area with leather chairs occupied one end, a small dining table the center, and what appeared to be private sleeping compartments the far end. Crystal decanters of amber liquid sat on a polished sidebar, and thick carpets muffled their footsteps. "Wolcott's private car," Jake whispered, recognizing the military memorabilia displayed in a glass case. Medals and citations from the Union Army, including several bearing the name Major Frederick Wolcott. "Where do we hide?" Margaret asked, keeping Samuel close. Jake scanned the car, considering options. "Under the sleeping berths. They're high enough off the floor to provide space, and unlikely to be checked during a short journey." They moved quickly to the sleeping section, finding two curtained berths built into the walls. Jake helped Margaret and Samuel into one, then positioned himself in the other, pulling the curtains closed just as voices approached from outside. "Should reach the rendezvous by tomorrow noon," a cultured voice was saying as the door opened, "giving us ample time to coordinate with Canton's men." "And what of Horn?" a second voice asked. "Any word?" "Nothing yet, but if the Sullivan woman and Ryland have the journal, Horn will find them." Jake recognized the first voice with a chill, Major Frederick Wolcott himself. The second speaker was unfamiliar, but clearly another association leader. "And if they've already reached Collins, or worse, the governor," the second man pressed. "Collins is being handled," Wolcott replied with cold confidence. "As for Warren, he's a politician. He'll recognize which way the wind is blowing once our operation succeeds. A few unfortunate incidents involving known rustlers, regrettable but necessary for territorial security. 50 dead homesteaders is more than a few incidents, Frederick. Acceptable losses to secure our interests," Wolcott dismissed. "The future of Wyoming will be determined by men of vision and resources, Harrington. Not by peasant farmers and petty thieves squatting on land they can't properly utilize." Jake heard the clink of glasses. The men were pouring drinks from the decanters. A whistle sounded from the locomotive, indicating preparations for departure. "To the future of Wyoming," Wolcott toasted. "And the end of the rustler problem." "To Wyoming?" the man called Harrington, echoed though with less enthusiasm. The train lurched into motion, wheels grinding against rails as it built up speed. Jake lay perfectly still in his hiding place, barely daring to breathe. Across the narrow aisle, he could see the edge of Margaret's dress through a gap in the curtain of her berth. A slight movement indicated she'd seen him too. They had successfully infiltrated the very heart of the enemy's operation, Wolcott's private car. But their position could not have been more precarious. A single sound, a single misstep, and they would be discovered. And if that happened, Jake had no illusions about their fate. The train gathered speed, racing southward toward Cheyenne. In the main compartment, Wolcott and Harrington continued their conversation, unaware of the silent passengers concealed mere feet away, passengers carrying the evidence that could destroy everything they had planned. Hours passed in tense silence. Eventually, Wolcott and Harrington moved to the sitting area of the car, where they were joined by other association members coming and going from the forward cars. Jake listened intently to their conversations, gathering valuable intelligence about the operation planned for Johnson County. The association had indeed assembled 50 hired guns from Texas, supplemented by another 20 or so local men loyal to their cause. The force was gathering at the TA Ranch, preparing to move out in 2 days' time. Their target list had expanded beyond the original blacklist to include virtually every small rancher in the county, a planned massacre disguised as a law enforcement action against alleged rustlers. As evening approached, the rhythm of the train changed, slowing, then accelerating through what must have been smaller stations along the route. From snippets of conversation Jake gathered, they were making good time and would reach Cheyenne before midnight. A steward brought dinner, which Wolcott and several other association leaders consumed with the casual conversation of men accustomed to power and its exercise. They discussed the operation as if planning a cattle drive rather than mass murder, logistics, timing, contingencies. "We'll need to control the narrative," one man was saying as he finished his meal. "Newspapers, telegraph offices." "Already arranged," Wolcott assured him. "The story will be one of necessary action against a criminal element. By the time anyone outside the territory hears differently, it will be a fait accompli." "And the governor? Leave Warren to me," Wolcott said confidently. "He's ambitious. Statehood is his priority. He won't risk delaying that for the sake of a few squatters." Jake felt a surge of anger at the casual dismissal of human lives. Families like Margaret's people, who had worked and sacrificed to build homes in this harsh land, reduced to squatters in the eyes of men like Wolcott. The train began to slow more distinctly, the rhythm of the wheels changing pitch. Through a small gap in the window curtain, Jake could see lights in the distance, Cheyenne approaching. He caught Margaret's eye through the gap in her curtain, giving a slight nod. Soon, they would need to move to find a way off the train and through the city to the governor's mansion. But with Wolcott and his men still in the car, their options were limited. Fate, however, intervened in an unexpected form. As the train slowed to navigate a series of switches on the approach to the Cheyenne yard, a violent lurch sent glassware crashing to the floor in the main compartment. "Damn engineers," Wolcott cursed. "Harrington, go tell that fool at the controls to take more care. This isn't a cattle car." As Harrington left through the forward door, another jolt rocked the train, harder this time, followed by the screech of emergency brakes. The car swayed alarmingly, objects tumbling from shelves and tables. "What the devil?" Wolcott began, but was cut off as the train ground to a sudden, violent halt that threw him and the other men from their seats. In the confusion that followed, Jake seized the moment. "Now!" he hissed, slipping from his berth and gesturing for Margaret and Samuel to do the same. "Out the back door while they're distracted." They moved silently toward the rear platform as Wolcott and his companions picked themselves up, cursing and shouting questions toward the front of the train. The night air struck them like a physical blow as they slipped outside, cold and crisp, carrying the smells of coal smoke and the nearby stockyards. They were on the outskirts of Cheyenne, the city's lights visible a mile or so ahead. The train had stopped on a curved section of track, the locomotive barely visible around the bend ahead. "Down," Jake whispered, helping Margaret and Samuel off the platform onto the gravel embankment beside the tracks. "Stay low and head for those trees." They moved quickly through the darkness, using the train itself as cover until they reached a small copse of trees about 100 yards from the tracks. From this vantage point, They could see men with lanterns moving along the train, inspecting the wheels and undercarriage. Something on the tracks, Jake surmised, watching the activity. Accidental or deliberate, it's bought us time. Which way to the governor's mansion? Margaret asked, keeping Samuel close against the cold. Jake oriented himself, identifying landmarks in the distance. Northwest through the city center, maybe 2 miles. Can we risk the main roads? Not with association men likely watching them, Jake replied. We'll have to take the back ways, stay in the shadows. Samuel, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke. The fake journal is gone. Margaret's hand went to her coat where they had stashed the decoy. The pocket was empty. It must have fallen out during the train's sudden stop. Jake cursed under his breath. If they find it, they'll know we were aboard. Margaret finished, her face pale in the moonlight. We need to move. Now. As if to confirm her words, a shout rose from the direction of the train, followed by the unmistakable sound of Wolcott's voice bellowing orders. Lanterns began to spread out from the tracks, moving in search patterns. They've found it, Jake said grimly. Run, stay together. They plunged deeper into the darkness, away from the searching lanterns racing against time and a powerful enemy, toward what might be their last hope for justice and survival. Cheyenne in winter was a city of shadows. Gaslight created pools of yellow illumination on the main streets, but the side alleys and back routes remained shrouded in darkness. Jake led Margaret and Samuel through this shadowed labyrinth, avoiding the well-lit avenues where association men might be watching. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they moved from one patch of darkness to the next, their breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Samuel kept pace without complaint, his small face set in lines of determination that made him look uncannily like his father. The governor's mansion is on Ferguson Street, Jake whispered as they paused in the shelter of a livery stable, just past the territorial offices. Will he see us at this hour? Margaret asked, massaging her injured arm, which had begun to throb anew with the cold and exertion. He'll see us, Jake said with more confidence than he felt. Collins's badge will get us past the guards and the journal. He glanced at Samuel, who carried the burden of his father's legacy, both literally and figuratively. The journal will do the rest. They moved on, keeping to the edges of the streets, freezing in place whenever horses or pedestrians passed nearby. Cheyenne was not yet asleep, despite the late hour. Saloons spilled light and raucous laughter into the street, while the occasional patrol of territorial police made their rounds. Hold, Jake warned, suddenly pulling them into a recessed doorway as a group of men emerged from a nearby hotel. Association men, judging by their expensive coats and arrogant bearing. Among them, Jake recognized Harrington from Wolcott's private car. Warren is being difficult, one man was saying as they passed near the hiding place. Says he needs more than accusations before he'll intervene. Wolcott will handle Warren, Harrington replied confidently, one way or another. The men continued down the street, their voices fading into the night. Jake exchanged a concerned glance with Margaret. Sounds like they're already pressuring the governor, he murmured. We need to reach him before Wolcott does. They resumed their careful progress through the city, the grand homes of Ferguson Street now visible ahead. The governor's mansion stood at the end of the block, a stately 2-story structure with a columned porch and light showing in several windows despite the late hour. 2 guards stood at the front gate, territorial police in full uniform. Jake studied them from the shadows, assessing their alertness and trying to determine if they might be association men or truly loyal to the governor. We can't risk the front entrance, he decided finally. Too exposed, and we don't know where their loyalties lie. There's a service entrance, Samuel said unexpectedly, at the rear of the property. Papa pointed it out when we visited Governor Warren last year. Jake and Margaret both looked at the boy in surprise. "You were here before?" Jake asked. Samuel nodded. "Papa had meetings with the governor. He brought me once. We entered through the back because Papa said it was more discreet for sensitive business." A faint smile touched Margaret's lips. "Thomas was teaching you strategy even then." "Always," Samuel agreed with his characteristic solemnity. Following Samuel's directions, they circled the block approaching the mansion from the rear, where a high stone wall surrounded a garden. A small gate, likely for deliveries and staff, stood partially concealed by evergreen shrubs. "It was unlocked when we came," Samuel recalled, studying the gate with a frown. "The cook leaves it open for early morning deliveries." Jake examined the lock, a simple mechanism that yielded easily to his pocket knife. "Some skills from my Pinkerton days," he explained at Margaret's raised eyebrow. The garden beyond was dormant for winter, its paths bordered by snow-covered shrubs. They crossed quickly to a back door where light spilled from a kitchen window. Inside, they could see a single figure moving about, an older woman in a cook's apron preparing what appeared to be a late meal. "Now what?" Margaret whispered. "We can hardly knock and announce ourselves." Jake considered their options, weighing risks against urgency. Before he could decide, the back door opened unexpectedly, and the cook emerged with a basin of water which she emptied onto a patch of snow. She froze at the sight of them, a woman, a child, and a blood-stained man standing in the governor's garden at near midnight. Her mouth opened presumably to scream when Samuel stepped forward. "Hello, Mrs. Gunderson," he said with formal politeness. "I'm Samuel Sullivan. You gave me gingerbread when I visited with my father last year." The woman's alarm transformed into confusion, then dawning recognition. "Captain Sullivan's boy? But what on earth—" "Please," Margaret stepped forward, her voice low and urgent. "We need to see Governor Warren immediately. It's a matter of life and death." Mrs. Gunderson hesitated, studying their faces in the spill of light from the kitchen door. Whatever she saw there, desperation, sincerity, or perhaps simply the unmistakable family resemblance between Samuel and his late father, seemed to decide her. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "The governor's in his study, working late as usual." They followed her through a warm kitchen fragrant with the smell of baking bread and into a service corridor that connected to the main house. Mrs. Gunderson led them to a paneled door where she knocked softly. "What is it, Mrs. Gunderson?" a tired voice called from within. "I told you I'd take the coffee later." "It's not coffee, sir," the cook replied. "It's visitors. Captain Sullivan's widow and son. They say it's urgent." A moment of silence, then rapid footsteps. The door opened to reveal Governor Amos Warren, a tall, dignified man in his 50s with a neatly trimmed beard shot through with gray. His eyes widened at the sight of them, taking in their disheveled appearance and obvious exhaustion. "Mrs. Sullivan, what in God's name—" His gaze shifted to Jake, noting the bloodstains and the revolver at his hip. "Who is this man?" "Jake Ryland." Jake introduced himself, producing Collins's badge. "Former Pinkerton, working with Sheriff James Collins of Johnson County. The sheriff is dead, sir, killed trying to get us and this evidence to you." He handed over the badge, which Warren accepted with a grave expression. "James Collins is dead. Murdered by association men," Margaret confirmed, "along with my husband before him. Governor Warren, we have proof of what they're planning. A massacre of homesteaders throughout Johnson County, scheduled to begin within days." Warren studied her face, then glanced at Samuel, who stood straight-backed and solemn beside his mother. Something in the boy's steady gaze seemed to affect the governor deeply. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "All of you. Mrs. Gunderson, bring coffee and something to eat, and send Franklin to me immediately." The governor's study was a handsome room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk covered in papers. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light over the leather chairs and oriental carpet. Warren closed and locked the door behind them, then turned to face his unexpected visitors. "Now," he said quietly, "tell me everything, and pray God we're not already too late." Dawn was breaking over Cheyenne, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, when the door to the governor's study finally opened. Warren emerged looking grim but resolute, followed by Margaret Jake and a sleepy but still attentive Samuel. Franklin Davis, the governor's private secretary, waited in the hallway with obvious anxiety. "Sir, what are your orders?" "Telegraph the president," Warren said decisively. "Request immediate federal intervention under Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. Guarantee of a Republican form of government and protection against domestic violence. Make it clear that armed insurrection is imminent." "Yes, sir." Davis hesitated. "And if the association men monitoring the telegraph office intercept the message?" "They won't," Warren assured him. "Captain Maynard and his men have already secured the main telegraph office. Send the message from there under military protection." As Davis hurried away, Warren turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've arranged rooms for you and your son. You need rest and medical attention." Margaret shook her head. "There's no time for rest, Governor. The association's men are already gathering. Every hour we delay puts more lives at risk." "She's right," Jake added. "Wolcott knows we escaped the train. He'll accelerate his plans, try to present you with a fait accompli before federal troops can arrive." Warren sighed, passing a hand over his tired face. "I understand your urgency, but there are procedures that must be followed even in crisis. The territorial militia is being mobilized, but it will take time to assemble enough men to counter the association's force." "How much time?" Jake pressed. "At least 48 hours before we can deploy in sufficient numbers," Warren admitted, "and that's if everything goes smoothly." "The homesteaders don't have 48 hours, Margaret said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "My neighbors, my friends, they're facing annihilation while we stand here talking about procedures." Warren's expression showed genuine regret. "Mrs. Sullivan, I sympathize with your position, but I can't send a token force against 50 armed men. It would be a slaughter." "Then let me go," Jake said suddenly. "Let me return to Johnson County with news that help is coming. I can organize the homesteaders, prepare defenses, buy time until your militia arrives." "That's suicide, Ryland," Warren protested. "You'd never make it past the association's scouts." "I might," Jake insisted. "And it's their only chance." Margaret stepped forward. "I'm going with him." "Absolutely not," Warren and Jake said simultaneously. "My home is there," Margaret continued as if they hadn't spoken. "My neighbors trusted Thomas, and they'll trust me. They need to know they're not abandoned, that help is coming." "And Samuel," Warren challenged, "would you risk your son's life as well?" "Samuel stays here," Margaret said firmly, "under your protection, Governor." The boy who had been listening quietly to the adult conversation suddenly spoke. "No." All eyes turned to him in surprise. Samuel rarely contradicted his mother directly. "I'm going too," he said with unusual determination. "Papa would go. He wouldn't hide while others fought." "Samuel." Margaret knelt before him, taking his thin shoulders in her hands. "This isn't about hiding. It's about surviving. You're the most important thing in my life. And you're the most important thing in mine," Samuel replied with adult gravity. "Which is why I can't let you go alone." Besides, he added with impeccable logic, I know all the hidden trails, the secret ways Papa showed me. I can help. Margaret looked into her son's gray eyes, so like her own, and saw something new there. Not just intelligence and perception, but a fierce courage that reminded her painfully of Thomas. For the first time, she truly understood that Samuel was not just her child to protect, but Thomas's son and heir in all the ways that mattered. We stay together, she said, finally rising to her feet. All of us. Warren looked between them, recognizing the futility of further argument. Very well, he sighed. But you won't go alone. I'm sending Captain Maynard and a detachment of territorial cavalry with you, 20 men, my most loyal troops. Not enough to defeat the association's force, but enough to organize a defense until federal reinforcements arrive. When can we leave? Jake asked. As soon as Maynard's men are assembled, Warren replied. 2 hours, perhaps 3. He moved to his desk and unlocked a drawer, removing a sealed document, which he handed to Jake. This is official authorization for martial law in Johnson County, signed by me as territorial governor. It gives Maynard authority to commandeer supplies, establish defensive positions, and arrest anyone threatening the peace, including association men. Jake accepted the document, recognizing its significance. This puts you in direct opposition to some very powerful men, Governor. Men who have forgotten that with great power comes great responsibility, Warren said gravely. Men who would subvert the very laws and institutions they claim to uphold. He looked at Samuel, his expression softening. Your father understood that young man. He was a true patriot, in the best sense of that word. Samuel nodded solemnly. Papa said patriotism means protecting the weak from the strong, not the other way around. Wise words, Warren agreed. Words this territory, soon to be state, would do well to remember. He turned to Margaret. Your husband's journal will be entered into the official record, Mrs. Sullivan. His sacrifice and Sheriff Collins's will not be forgotten. A knock at the door interrupted them. Franklin Davis had returned, his face flushed with exertion. Sir, message sent and confirmation received. The President has authorized deployment of federal troops from Fort Russell. They'll be ready to march within 6 hours. Excellent, Warren nodded. And Wolcott, no sign of him at his usual haunts, Davis reported. But there's increased activity at the association's headquarters. They know something's happening. Then we move faster, Warren decided. Franklin, tell Captain Maynard he has 1 hour to assemble his men. Mrs. Sullivan and her party leave for Johnson County as soon as possible. He turned to Jake. Mr. Ryland, I'm officially deputizing you as a territorial marshal for the duration of this crisis. The authority may prove useful. Jake accepted the hastily produced badge with a nod of thanks. I hope it won't be necessary, but it can't hurt. As they prepared to leave, Warren drew Margaret aside. Mrs. Sullivan, I want you to know that I considered Thomas a friend, as well as a valuable advisor. Had I known what he'd discovered, what he was facing, he trailed off, regret evident in his face. You know now, Margaret said simply. Make it count. The ride north was a grueling test of endurance. Captain Maynard, a veteran cavalry officer with a weathered face and no-nonsense demeanor, set a punishing pace, pushing his men and horses to the limit of their stamina. They traveled cross-country, avoiding the main roads where association scouts might be watching, using the terrain for cover whenever possible. Jake rode beside Margaret, keeping a watchful eye on her and Samuel. The boy showed remarkable resilience, maintaining his position in the saddle hour after hour without complaint. His face, usually so stoic and controlled, occasionally lit with something like excitement at this great adventure. Moments when he looked like any other 10-year-old boy rather than the prematurely serious child he'd become after his father's death. They stopped only when absolutely necessary to rest the horses and take hasty meals of hardtack and jerky from their saddlebags. During one such break, as twilight was gathering around them, Captain Maynard approached Jake with a worried expression. "Rider coming in from the north," he reported quietly. "One of our advance scouts. Says there's a large body of men moving south from the TA ranch." "The association force?" Jake asked, tension coiling in his gut. "Seems likely. At least 40 mounted men, heavily armed, moving with purpose." Jake cursed under his breath. "They're starting early. Wolcott must have decided to act before the governor could mobilize." "What's their heading?" "Southeast, toward the Carlson homestead." Jake's blood ran cold. The Carlson place was the largest of the small ranches where several homesteader families had gathered for mutual protection during the winter months. Men, women, children, perhaps 20 people in all, defending themselves with hunting rifles and shotguns against professional killers. "How far ahead of us are they?" 2 hours, maybe less," Maynard estimated. "We've been gaining ground, but they've got a head start." Jake turned to Margaret, who had joined them, and overheard the report. Her face had gone pale, but her eyes remained resolute. "The Carlson place," she said quietly. "Ingrid Peterson and her family are staying there. 3 other families as well." "We'll reach them first," Jake promised, though he wasn't at all certain they could. "Warn them, organize a defense." "We need to split our force," Maynard decided. "I'll take 15 men and push ahead at maximum speed. You follow with the remainder and Mrs. Sullivan." Jake nodded agreement, but Margaret shook her head. "I'm going with the advance party," she stated flatly. "The Petersons are my friends. They protected Samuel when the association men came. I won't abandon them now." "It's too dangerous," Jake protested. "Every moment of the past week has been dangerous," Margaret countered. "I didn't come this far to wait safely in the rear while others fight my battles." She looked at Samuel, who watched the exchange with his usual perceptive gaze. "Samuel will stay with you." This time the boy didn't protest. Perhaps he recognized the steel in his mother's voice, or perhaps he understood that this was not a moment for debate. "I'll calculate the most efficient route," he offered instead, pulling a small map from his coat pocket, one of Thomas's that he'd apparently kept with him all this time. "Based on terrain and known association positions." Maynard looked impressed despite himself. "Smart lad. Smarter than most men I know," Jake agreed, squeezing Samuel's shoulder briefly. "All right, Margaret. You go with Maynard. But for God's sake, stay behind his men when the fighting starts." The ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I make no promises, Mr. Ryland." They separated within minutes, Maynard leading his detachment and Margaret north at a gallop, while Jake remained with Samuel and the rest of the territorial cavalry. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the gathering darkness, Jake found himself fighting an irrational urge to chase after them, to keep Margaret within sight and under his protection. "She'll be all right," Samuel said unexpectedly, as if reading his thoughts. "Mama is very capable." Jake looked down at the boy, struck anew by his unusual perceptiveness. "Yes, she is," he agreed. "One of the most capable people I've ever met." "Like Papa was," Samuel continued, his eyes on the distant horizon where the advance party had disappeared. "They were well matched. Papa said that was important in a partnership, complementary strengths." "Your father was a wise man," Samuel nodded solemnly. "He said you have to be to survive out here." He glanced up at Jake, his gray eyes evaluating in that disconcertingly adult way of his. "You and Mama are well matched, too." The observation caught Jake off guard. "Samuel, it's a logical conclusion based on observed data." the boy continued matter-of-factly. You work efficiently together. Your skills complement each other, and you look at her the way Papa used to before the darkness came. Jake had no response to that. He was saved from having to find one by Captain Maynard's lieutenant, calling for them to mount up and continue their journey. As they rode through the gathering night, Jake found his thoughts divided between the immediate tactical concerns of their mission and Samuel's observation. The boy was right, of course. Somewhere in the midst of danger and desperation, Jake had developed feelings for Margaret Sullivan that went far beyond professional respect or the natural protectiveness he might feel for a client. But now was not the time for such reflections. Ahead lay a confrontation that would determine the fate of dozens of innocent lives, and perhaps the future of Wyoming itself. Personal considerations would have to wait, if they survived the coming storm. The Carlson homestead appeared as a cluster of lights in the pre-dawn darkness. Jake's detachment had pushed hard through the night, stopping only when the horses absolutely required rest. Samuel had finally succumbed to exhaustion around midnight, sleeping in the saddle with Jake's arm supporting him. As they approached the homestead, Jake could see that defenses had already been established. Wagons positioned as barricades armed men at strategic points around the main house and barn. Maynard's advance party had arrived in time. A sentry challenged them at the perimeter, relaxing when he recognized the territorial cavalry uniforms. Jake dismounted, carefully transferring the still-sleeping Samuel to his arms before approaching the main house. Inside, he found organized chaos. Homesteaders preparing ammunition, positioning furniture as additional barricades, women calmly packing supplies for a potential retreat. Captain Maynard stood at a table in the center of the main room discussing strategy with several homesteaders over a rough map of the area. And there was Margaret moving among the families with quiet authority, helping an elderly woman secure her belongings, offering words of reassurance to frightened children. She looked up as Jake entered, with Samuel relief washing over her face. "You made good time," she said, crossing to take her sleeping son from Jake's arms. "Any sign of pursuit?" "None yet," Jake reported. "But they can't be far behind." Maynard joined them, his expression grim. "We've got perhaps 2 hours before they arrive based on our scout reports. 43 men heavily armed, led by Frank Canton himself. Wolcott, not with them, presumably still in Cheyenne maintaining deniability." Jake nodded, unsurprised. Men like Wolcott rarely dirtied their own hands when others could be paid to do the killing. "What's our situation?" he asked, surveying the improvised fortress. 22 homesteaders capable of bearing arms," Maynard reported, "plus my 15 men and your 5. Against 43 professionals, it's not good odds." "We don't need to defeat them," Jake reminded him. "Just hold out until the federal troops arrive." "How long?" "Governor Warren's last telegram estimated 12 hours from our current time," Maynard said. "If they maintain maximum speed." 12 hours, Jake repeated, calculating rapidly. "If we can hold this position for the first assault, they'll likely fall back and reconsider. That buys us time. And if we can't hold," Jake's expression hardened, "then we make them pay dearly for every foot of ground they take." Margaret had placed Samuel on a makeshift bed in the corner, tucking a blanket around him with gentle hands. Now she rejoined the men, her face set in determined lines. "The families should withdraw to the root cellar," she suggested. "It's reinforced with timber supports. Should provide protection from stray bullets." "Agreed," Maynard nodded. "And we'll position my men along the north perimeter where the approach is most exposed. Homesteaders can cover the flanks and rear." They continued planning defenses, positioning fighters, distributing the limited ammunition available. Jake was impressed by the calm efficiency of the homesteaders. men and women who had carved lives from this harsh land facing adversity as a matter of course. They were not professional soldiers, but they possessed something perhaps more valuable: the fierce determination of people defending their homes and families. As the eastern sky began to lighten, Jake climbed to the hayloft of the barn, which offered the best vantage point of the surrounding landscape. The Wyoming plains stretched before him, white with snow and tinged pink by the approaching dawn. Beautiful, serene, and soon to be stained with blood. He heard footsteps on the ladder behind him and turned to see Margaret ascending to join him. She moved to stand beside him at the loft door, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "Samuel," he asked, "still sleeping? Mrs. Carlson is watching him." She gazed out at the sunrise, her profile etched in gold and rose. "It's strange. I've seen this view 100 times, but it looks different now. Because of what's coming, because of what's already happened," she corrected. "A week ago, I believed Thomas had abandoned us by choice, that I was alone in a fight I couldn't win." She turned to face him, her gray eyes reflecting the dawn light. "Now I know he died trying to prevent this day. And I'm not alone." Jake met her gaze, feeling a connection that transcended words. "No," he agreed softly. "You're not alone." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of all that had happened and all that was yet to come, hanging between them. Then Margaret spoke again, her voice low but steady. "If we don't survive this, we will," Jake interrupted firmly. A faint smile touched her lips. "If we don't," she continued, "I want you to know that I'm grateful, not just for your help, but for restoring my faith in Thomas's memory, for showing Samuel that there are still good men in this world." "Margaret," Jake began, then stopped, uncertain how to express the tangle of emotions that had grown within him during their brief, intense acquaintance. Before he could find the words, a shout from below interrupted them. "Riders approaching from the north, at least 40, coming fast." The moment broken, they exchanged one last look before descending rapidly to join the defenders. The association's force had arrived, and with them, the final reckoning. The first attack came with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Canton's men charged directly at the homestead's northern perimeter, clearly expecting to overwhelm the defenders through sheer force and firepower. They were met with a disciplined volley from Maynard's cavalry, positioned behind the wagon barricades, and accurate fire from homesteaders who knew every fold in the terrain. The attackers fell back in surprise, leaving several men and horses down in the snow. They regrouped at a safer distance, and Jake could see Canton gesticulating as he reorganized his force for a more coordinated assault. "They didn't expect organized resistance," Maynard observed from his position beside Jake. "Thought they'd be slaughtering unarmed farmers." "They'll be more careful now," Jake warned. "Canton's no fool. He'll probe for weaknesses, try to flank us." As if confirming his assessment, the association force split into 3 groups. The largest remained to the north, while smaller contingents began circling to the east and west, seeking to surround the homestead. "Lieutenant," Maynard called to his second-in-command, "take 10 men and reinforce the western approach. Sullivan, you've got 5 men on the east. Hold your positions at all costs." Jake moved quickly to the eastern barricade, where 5 territorial cavalrymen and several homesteaders waited with grim determination. Among them was Ingrid Peterson, the Swedish neighbor who had protected Samuel during the attack on the Sullivan Ranch. She held a shotgun with the confidence of long familiarity. "Mrs. Peterson," Jake acknowledged with respect, "you should be in the cellar with the other women and children." The older woman snorted derisively. "I kill wolves that threaten my flock since I was 12 years old. These men are just wolves in fancy coats." Jake couldn't argue with her logic or her right to defend her community. He positioned the defenders carefully, using every scrap of cover available, and waited for the attack he knew was coming. It began with covering fire from the northern group, bullets thudding into the wooden barricades and whistling overhead. Under this suppression, the eastern flanking party charged, expecting to find the defenders pinned down. Instead, they rode into a carefully coordinated crossfire. Jake had positioned his men to create interlocking fields of fire, leaving no safe approach. The first wave of attackers fell back in disarray, leaving 3 men down and several horses wounded. Similar scenarios played out on the western and northern perimeters, Canton's men repeatedly probing for weaknesses, the defenders holding firm. But with each exchange, precious ammunition was expended. By mid-morning, Jake was counting cartridges and calculating how long they could maintain this defense. "How are we doing?" Margaret asked, appearing beside him with a canteen of water. She had been moving between defensive positions, carrying messages, distributing ammunition, and tending to the few minor wounds they'd sustained. "Holding them off so far," Jake replied, accepting the water gratefully. "But they're being smarter now, more patient, testing us, looking for vulnerabilities. And ammunition." "Running low," he admitted. "Another hour of this, and we'll be down to a handful of rounds per man." Margaret's face remained composed, though her eyes betrayed her concern. "Samuel has been calculating trajectories and fields of fire. He says, if we consolidate our defense around the house and barn, we can maintain coverage with fewer shots." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Your son is something else, Margaret." "Yes," she agreed with quiet pride. "He is." A renewed volley of gunfire from the north interrupted their conversation. This assault seemed more determined than previous ones, Canton's men pushing closer to the barricades before falling back. "They're getting bolder," Jake observed. "Or more desperate. Federal troops must be getting closer." As the morning wore on, the pattern continued. Attack-defense withdrawal, then another attack from a different angle. The defenders held, but casualties began to mount. 2 of Maynard's men were wounded, along with several homesteaders. Ammunition dwindled to critical levels. By noon, they had been forced to abandon the outer perimeter, consolidating their defense around the main house and barn as Samuel had suggested. The association forces had also taken losses, at least 8 men dead or seriously wounded, but they still outnumbered the defenders nearly 2 to 1. 6 hours, Maynard reported grimly during a brief lull. 6 more hours until federal relief arrives, assuming they're on schedule. "We can hold," Jake insisted, though the situation looked increasingly dire. "Canton's men are getting frustrated. They expected this to be over by now." As if summoned by his words, a white flag appeared among the association forces. A single rider approached the defensive perimeter, stopping just out of effective rifle range. "Sullivan," the man called. "Jake Ryland, I know you're in there. Frank Canton wants to parley." Jake exchanged glances with Maynard, who shrugged. "Might buy us time." "Could be a trap," Jake countered. "Let me go," Margaret said unexpectedly. "They won't expect a woman. And Canton knows who I am, Thomas's widow." "Absolutely not," Jake replied immediately. "It's too dangerous. Every minute they're talking is a minute they're not shooting," Margaret pointed out with implacable logic. "And every minute brings the federal troops closer." Before Jake could formulate another objection, Captain Maynard intervened. "She's right, Ryland, and we'll cover her every step of the way." Jake wanted to argue further, but the tactical sense of the suggestion was undeniable, and he had learned by now that Margaret Sullivan was not a woman easily dissuaded once her mind was set. "I'll go with you," he said finally. "We meet them halfway, no closer." Margaret nodded agreement, her face betraying no fear, only resolute determination. They arranged a ceasefire, then emerged from behind the barricades, walking slowly toward the neutral ground between the two forces. Frank Canton and another man rode forward to meet them. Canton was a hard-faced man in his 40s with cold eyes and the weathered look of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. He had once been a lawman before turning his skills to the service of the association. "Mrs. Sullivan," Canton acknowledged with a tip of his hat that managed to be both courteous and condescending. "Mr. Ryland, this is an unfortunate situation." "Unfortunate?" Margaret's voice was ice. "You're attacking innocent families, Mr. Canton. There's nothing unfortunate about it. It's criminal." The Canton's expression didn't change. "We're pursuing known rustlers, ma'am, acting under the authority of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association to protect legitimate property interests." "Save it for the newspapers, Canton," Jake cut in. "We know what this is. Wolcott's private war against homesteaders who refuse to be bullied off their land." "Speaking of newspapers," Canton continued as if Jake hadn't spoken, "I'm authorized to offer terms. Surrender now, and all women and children will be allowed safe passage to Cheyenne. The men will receive fair trials for rustling charges." "Fair trials?" Margaret's laugh held no humor. "Like the fair trial my husband received before he was murdered." A flicker of something, perhaps genuine regret, crossed Canton's face. Captain Sullivan's death was regrettable, not authorized, at least not in that manner. "But authorized all the same," Jake pressed, watching Canton carefully. "On Wolcott's orders." Canton didn't confirm or deny, but his silence was answer enough. "These are the only terms you'll receive," he said instead. "Governor Warren's territorial cavalry has no legal authority here. You're harboring known criminals." "We're defending American citizens against an illegal private army," Jake countered. "And federal troops are already on their way from Fort Russell with presidential authorization." This was apparently news to Canton, whose composure slipped momentarily. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Jake produced Governor Warren's authorization of martial law, passing it to Canton. "This is why Wolcott isn't here, isn't it? He knows this operation crossed the line from enforcement to insurrection. He's leaving you holding the bag, Frank." Canton read the document, his expression darkening. "This changes nothing. Warren has overstepped his authority. Tell that to the federal judge who'll be presiding over your trial for murder," Margaret said coldly. "Here are our terms, Mr. Canton. Withdraw your men now, and we'll recommend leniency when the federal authorities arrive. Continue this attack, and you'll face the full consequences of your actions." "You're outgunned and outnumbered," Canton reminded her. "This is your last chance." "No, Mr. Canton," Margaret replied with quiet dignity. "It's yours." For a moment, Jake thought Canton might order them seized or shot on the spot. Instead, the man refolded the document and handed it back to Jake. "You've made your choice," he said flatly. "What happens next is on your heads." He turned his horse and rode back toward his men, the parley clearly over. "That went well," Jake remarked dryly as they walked back toward their own lines. "It bought us 20 minutes, Margaret pointed out, and confirmed what we suspected about Thomas's death. Jake nodded grimly. "Wolcott gave the order, and now Canton knows federal troops are coming. He'll either withdraw or hit us with everything he has trying to finish this before they arrive." "Which do you think he'll choose?" "Frank Canton didn't get his reputation by running from a fight," Jake said. "He'll attack, soon, with everything he has." They had barely reached the safety of their barricades when his prediction was confirmed. The association's force launched a coordinated assault from all sides, firing continuously as they advanced toward the defensive perimeter. "Here they come," Maynard called. "Make every shot count." The final battle for the Carlson homestead, and perhaps for the future of Wyoming, had begun. End of Part 5, The End.